Chapter 1. The Letter. Narcissa. Malfoy had always found February afternoons to be the most melancholy time at the manor. The winter light slanted through the tall windows of the morning room with a quality that seemed perpetually apologetic, as though even the sun understood it was intruding upon something private and fragile. She sat with her afternoon tea growing cold, the delicate spode china cup forgotten in its saucer, while she sorted through the day's correspondence with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that routine could hold despair at bay. The owl post had been unusually heavy today. Bills from Diagon Alley, invitations to tedious social functions where wives of ministry officials would smile with their mouths and calculate with their eyes, and the usual array of correspondence that came with being married to Lucius Malfoy. She set aside a letter bearing the Parkinson family seal, undoubtedly another attempt by Pansy's mother to arrange some sort of understanding between the children, as though Draco were a prize stallion to be bred for the continuation of proper bloodlines. It was Draco's letter that made her pause. The familiar owl, a sturdy barn owl the school provided for students without their own, had deposited the thick envelope beside her teacup with what seemed like unusual haste, as though it too were eager to be away from whatever news it carried. Narcissa recognized her son's careful script immediately, though something about the formation of the letters struck her as odd. Less controlled than usual, more hurried. She opened the letter with the silver knife Lucius had given her for their first anniversary, the blade sliding through the wax seal with practiced ease. Draco wrote home every fortnight, as was expected of a Malfoy heir, but his letters had grown increasingly perfunctory over the past few months. Polite reports on his marks, careful mentions of professors who continued to favor him appropriately, and strategic complaints about Potter's continued presence at the school that she suspected were included more for her and Lucius's benefit than from any genuine feeling. This letter was different. Mother, I hope this finds you and Father well. Term continues much as before, though I confess the fourth-year curriculum grows more demanding by the week. Professor Snape has been particularly exacting in his expectations, which I suppose should come as no surprise. Something rather extraordinary happened in potions yesterday that I thought you might find interesting. Potter, yes, the famous Harry Potter, collapsed during class. Not a swoon or a dramatic faint, mind you, but a proper collapse that had Granger shrieking and even Weasley looking pale around the gills. Narcissa found herself leaning forward, the letter closer to her face than was strictly necessary. There was something in Draco's tone, an attempt at casualness that felt forced, artificial. Professor Snape had assigned us to brew Veritaserum antidotes, a rather advanced potion for our year level, but Potter managed to botch his ingredients as usual. When the potion began smoking green instead of silver, Professor Snape suggested Potter might benefit from a more hands-on learning experience. He added powdered moonstone to Potter's cauldron himself, said it would demonstrate the importance of precision, but the reaction was rather more violent than expected. The explosion wasn't large, but Potter caught the worst of the fumes, started convulsing right there at his workbench. Granger was screaming for Madame Pomfrey, while Professor Snape just stood there watching. Said it would teach Potter the consequences of shoddy preparation, though Potter hadn't actually done anything wrong with the Moonstone addition, since Snape added it himself. Narcissa set the letter down, with hands that had developed a slight tremor. She reached for her teacup, more for something to do with her fingers than from any desire for Earl Grey that had grown cold and bitter in the 20 minutes since it had been poured. They took Potter to the hospital wing unconscious. Word is he didn't wake up until this morning, and even then Madame Pomfrey wouldn't let him return to classes until Thursday. Granger's been in quite a state about it all, though I can't imagine why anyone would be surprised. Potter's been having accidents in potions for years now. The casual way Draco wrote those words, accidents in inverted commas, as though he were making some sort of joke, sent something cold sliding down Narcissa's spine. She thought of her own son, bent over a cauldron in the same classroom, under the supervision of the same professor who had just deliberately caused a student to collapse. Professor Snape says Potter's collapse was entirely his own fault for not paying proper attention to the potion's color changes. Though, as I mentioned, Potter hadn't actually been the one handling the ingredients when things went wrong. Still, I suppose the lesson was learned. Potter looked green around the gills at breakfast this morning, though that might have been nerves about facing potions again today. I trust you're well, and that Father's business at the ministry continues successfully. Please give my regards to the peacocks. Your devoted son, Draco. Narcissa read the letter through twice more, her mind catching on details that Draco had included almost as afterthoughts. Potter hadn't done anything wrong. Snape had added the problematic ingredient himself. The reaction was rather more violent than expected, but expected nonetheless. Potter had been unconscious for nearly 18 hours, and most disturbing of all, Draco's casual mention that Potter had been having accidents for years. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, the letter still clutched in her hand. The manor's grounds stretched away toward the line of bare elms that marked the boundary of their property, skeletal against the grey February sky. Somewhere beyond those trees, past the village and the rolling countryside, her son sat in classes every day under the authority of a man who had just deliberately poisoned a student. Not just any student. Harry Potter, the boy who lived. The child whose survival had broken the Dark Lord's first rise to power. If Severus Snape was willing to harm Harry Potter, publicly, in front of a classroom full of witnesses, what might he be willing to do to Draco when no one was watching? The thought made her stomach clench with the kind of cold fear she hadn't felt since the war. She had always known Severus to be sharp-tongued and demanding, but she had assumed his harshness was the calculated severity of a professor who understood that the children under his care would need strength to survive in a world still shadowed by dark magic. She had never imagined cruelty for its own sake, but there was something in Draco's careful words, his studied nonchalance, that suggested this incident was neither isolated nor accidental. The way he wrote about Potter's previous accidents, as though they were common knowledge, expected occurrences that no longer warranted surprise or concern. Narcissa pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window and thought about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She had married Lucius in part because he offered stability in an uncertain world, protection for any children they might have. She had supported his alliances and politics because she believed they would create a safer future for her family. But if her son was in danger now, if the very institution where he was supposed to be protected was the source of that danger, then politics and alliances meant nothing at all. She looked down at Draco's letter again, noting details she had missed in her first reading. The careful way he avoided criticizing Professor Snape directly. The almost studied detachment with which he described Potter's suffering. The suggestion that such incidents were normal, expected, perhaps even deserved. What was Severus Snape teaching her son? And what was Draco learning from these lessons that went far beyond the proper brewing of potions? Narcissa folded the letter with deliberate precision and placed it in the pocket of her robes. Lucius would not return from the ministry until Thursday. Some tedious committee work regarding new import regulations that would keep him in meetings and dinner engagements for the better part of the week. He would want to handle this through proper channels, would insist on speaking with Severus privately before taking any formal action. Would remind her that Severus Snape was a family friend, a fellow Slytherin, a man who had served their interests faithfully during the war. But Narcissa was thinking of her son's careful words, his studied casualness in describing another child suffering. She was thinking of what lessons Draco was learning in those dungeons, and what kind of man those lessons might shape him into. The afternoon light was fading toward the grey dusk that came early in February, but Narcissa felt something sharp and clear crystallizing in her chest, a decision that tasted like winter air and felt as inevitable as nightfall. She would not wait for Lucius to return. She would not allow proper channels and old alliances to determine her son's safety. Tomorrow morning, she would dress in her finest robes, pin her hair with the black family diamonds that proclaimed her heritage more clearly than any words, and she would walk into the Ministry of Magic to see Amelia Bones. If Harry Potter wasn't safe at Hogwarts, then neither was Draco, and Narcissa Malfoy had never been the sort of mother who allowed her child to remain in danger while she observed the niceties of Wizarding Society's expectations. The tea had gone entirely cold now, but she felt warmer than she had in months. Chapter 2. The March to the Ministry. The morning came grey and bitter, with the sort of February cold that seemed to seep through stone and settle in one's bones. Narcissa stood before her wardrobe in the pre-dawn darkness, selecting her armor with the same deliberate care a knight might choose chainmail before battle. The midnight blue robes with silver threading, formal enough to command respect, expensive enough to remind anyone who saw her that the black family fortune had not diminished with the changing political winds. The diamond brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, Violetta Black, pinned precisely over her heart. Her hair swept back in the severe style that made her cheekbones appear sharp enough to cut glass. She had not slept. The hours between midnight and dawn had been spent pacing the length of her bedroom, Draco's letter read and reread, until she could recite every carefully chosen word. Each time she reached the part about Potter's accidents, something twisted in her stomach with a violence that reminded her of the early months of her pregnancy, when even the thought of food had made her retch. The house elves had prepared breakfast, but Narcissa found she could manage nothing more than black coffee that burned her throat and settled in her empty stomach like acid. She sat at the small table in her private sitting room, not the grand dining room where she and Lucius took their formal meals, but the intimate space where she wrote her correspondence and managed the household accounts. The room felt smaller this morning, as though the walls had drawn closer while she slept. Or perhaps it was simply that the world itself felt smaller now that she understood what she was about to do. Severus Snape had been a friend to their family for more than 15 years. He had stood as Draco's magical guardian when the boy was still in his cradle, had attended every birthday celebration until Draco began school. He had been Lucius's ally during the war, one of the few who had emerged from that dark time with his reputation not merely intact, but enhanced. When other former Death Eaters had fled the country or found themselves in Azkaban, Severus had secured a position of respect and authority at the most prestigious school in magical Britain. And now she was going to destroy him, because that was what this would mean, she knew. Once she walked into the ministry and made her accusations formal, there would be no taking them back. No quiet conversations between old friends, no opportunity for Severus to explain himself or modify his teaching methods. The moment she spoke, Draco's words aloud to ministry officials, Severus Snape would become the subject of an official investigation that would end with his disgrace and removal from Hogwarts. The loyalty she owed him should have stopped her. The bonds of old alliance, the debts of friendship and mutual support that had sustained their circle through the years when being associated with the losing side of a war could mean social death or worse. Severus had never asked for anything in return for his guardianship of Draco, had never leveraged his position to gain favor with Lucius or access to the Malfoy fortune. But when she closed her eyes, she could see her son bent over a cauldron, while Severus Snape added ingredients with deliberately destructive intent. Could imagine Draco's confusion as his carefully prepared potion began to smoke and bubble. His terror as he breathed in fumes that burned his lungs and sent him into convulsions. Could picture him lying unconscious in the hospital wing for 18 hours, while his professor felt nothing but satisfaction at a lesson well taught. The coffee had gone cold in her cup, but she drained it anyway, welcoming the bitter aftertaste that matched her mood. By 7:30, she was standing in the grand foyer of the Ministry of Magic, her traveling cloak still dusted with flue powder, and her chin raised at the angle that had intimidated lesser purebloods since her debutante season. The morning rush was in full swing, witches and wizards hurrying toward the lifts with the harried expressions of people who had spent too long in line at the public flue networks, ministry workers clutching cups of coffee that steamed in the cool underground air. She approached the reception desk with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being noticed, her heels clicking against the marble floor with satisfying precision. The witch behind the desk, a middle-aged woman with iron-grey hair and the weary expression of someone who had been answering the same questions for 20 years, looked up with the practiced smile of a civil servant. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "I need to see Madame Bones," Narcissa said without preamble. "The matter is urgent." The receptionist's smile flickered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "Madame Bones's schedule is quite full today, I'm afraid." "I am Narcissa Black Malfoy," Narcissa said, letting each word fall with the weight of old money and older bloodlines. "I require an immediate audience with the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement regarding a matter of child safety." The effect was immediate. The receptionist's spine straightened, and she reached for a speaking tube with movements that had suddenly become much more efficient. Behind Narcissa, she could hear the subtle shift in conversations as other ministry workers recognized her name and began whispering among themselves. Lady Malfoy at the ministry, seeking an audience with the head of magical law enforcement. The gossip would be all over Diagon Alley by lunchtime. "Madame Bones's office." "Yes, this is reception. I have Mrs. Narcissa Malfoy here, requesting an immediate audience." "Yes, I understand. Of course." The receptionist replaced the speaking tube and looked up at Narcissa with an expression that managed to be both deferential and professionally neutral. "Madame Bones can see you in an hour. Someone will be down to escort you to her office." "Thank you." Narcissa settled herself in one of the uncomfortable chairs that lined the reception area, arranging her robes with practiced elegance, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Around her, the morning bustle of the ministry continued, workers hurrying toward lifts, visitors queuing at various department reception desks, the occasional owl swooping through the vast atrium with messages clutched in its talons. She recognized some of the faces. Ministry officials who had attended the same social functions as she and Lucius, who had made polite conversation about their children's achievements and the weather, while carefully avoiding any mention of the war that had divided their world so recently. They nodded to her with the distant courtesy, reserved for someone whose political associations were known, but whose social standing demanded acknowledgement. It was Arthur Weasley who surprised her. She saw him emerge from one of the lifts, his distinctive red hair unmistakable even at a distance, his robes bearing the subtle wrinkles that spoke of a man who dressed for function rather than fashion. He was walking with purposeful strides toward the reception area, a stack of files tucked under one arm, when his eyes met hers across the crowded atrium. He stopped. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The wife of Lucius Malfoy and the father of Ron Weasley, two people whose children attended the same school and whose families represented everything the other opposed. Then, to her surprise, Arthur Weasley changed direction and walked toward her. "Mrs. Malfoy," he said, when he reached her chair, his voice carefully neutral. "I hope everything is well with Draco?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely concerned rather than merely polite, that Narcissa found herself looking up at him with something approaching gratitude. Here was a man whose family had been targets during the war, whose youngest son shared a dormitory with Harry Potter himself, and yet his first thought upon seeing her was for her child's welfare. There has been an incident at school, she said, choosing her words with care. I felt it necessary to bring the matter to official attention. Arthur's expression grew more serious. I see. Well, Amelia Bones is a fair woman. If there's been a genuine problem, she'll listen. He paused, as though weighing his words, then leaned slightly closer. Mrs. Malfoy, if you don't mind me saying, you look quite determined this morning. Whatever's happened, I hope you find the resolution you're seeking. With that, he nodded politely and continued toward the reception desk, leaving Narcissa staring after him with an odd warmth spreading through her chest. Arthur Weasley had just offered her encouragement. Arthur Weasley, whose family represented everything the old pure-blood families claimed to despise, had looked at her and seen nothing more threatening than a worried mother. The hour passed with agonizing slowness. Narcissa found herself watching the ministry workers hurry past, noting the way they moved with purpose and urgency that spoke of meaningful work, important tasks that served the broader magical community. When had she last felt that sense of purpose? When had the social obligations and political maneuvering that filled her days ever felt like something more substantial than elaborate theatre? She thought of Voldemort's ideology, the beliefs that had shaped her youth and influenced her marriage. Blood purity, the natural superiority of ancient magical families, the importance of maintaining traditional hierarchies that kept the wizarding world strong and stable. She had never questioned those principles, had raised Draco to understand his place in that carefully ordered world. But what did any of that matter if the institutions that were supposed to protect pure-blood children were the very places where they faced danger? What good was magical superiority if it couldn't keep her son safe from a professor who used his authority to inflict deliberate harm? When the young wizard arrived to escort her to Amelia Bones's office, Narcissa rose from her chair with movements that felt suddenly lighter than they had in years. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was about to do something that mattered more than social standing or political advantage. She was about to choose her child's safety over everything else, and the choice felt like coming home to herself at last. The lift carried them upward through the ministry's levels with mechanical precision, but Narcissa's thoughts were already racing ahead to the conversation that awaited her. She would tell Amelia Bones about Draco's letter. She would describe the pattern of accidents that her son had mentioned so casually. She would demand an investigation that would protect not just Draco, but every child who sat in Severus Snape's classroom. And if that meant betraying old loyalties and destroying old friendships, then perhaps those loyalties and friendships had been built on foundations too rotten to deserve preservation. Chapter 3. The Interview. Amelia Bones's office occupied a corner of the second level that managed to convey both authority and accessibility. Tall windows that let in what little winter light February could offer, shelves lined with law books whose spines showed the wear of frequent consultation, and a desk that bore the organized chaos of someone who dealt with serious matters on a daily basis. When Narcissa was escorted through the door, she found herself facing a woman whose reputation for fairness had preceded her into every conversation about ministry justice. Amelia Bones was not a physically imposing woman, but there was something in her bearing that commanded immediate respect. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and her plain black robes suggested someone more interested in function than fashion. She rose from behind her desk as Narcissa entered, offering a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. "Mrs. Malfoy," she said, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Please have a seat. I understand you have concerns regarding your son's education. Narcissa settled herself in the chair across from Amelia's desk, placing her handbag in her lap, with movements that were perhaps more controlled than strictly necessary. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Madam Bones. I realize your time is valuable." "Child safety is always a priority," Amelia replied, pulling a fresh piece of parchment toward her and dipping her quill in ink. "Now, your message mentioned an incident at Hogwarts. Would you mind starting from the beginning?" There was something in Amelia's tone that suggested skepticism, not hostile, but carefully neutral in the way of someone who had learned to be wary of complaints from parents whose children attended prestigious schools. Narcissa understood the woman's caution. Wealthy families were notorious for demanding special treatment when their offspring faced academic challenges or disciplinary action. "Yesterday I received a letter from my son," Narcissa began, retrieving the folded parchment from her handbag. "Draco is in his 4th year at Hogwarts. He wrote to inform me about an incident in his potions class involving Harry Potter." Amelia's quill paused over her parchment. "Harry Potter?" "Yes." Narcissa placed Draco's letter on the desk between them. "According to my son, Mr. Potter collapsed during class after Professor Snape deliberately added an ingredient to his potion that caused a violent reaction. Mr. Potter was unconscious for 18 hours. The skepticism in Amelia's expression shifted toward something sharper, the focused attention of a trained investigator encountering a claim that demanded serious consideration. She reached for the letter and read it through twice, her frown deepening with each line. "Your son states here that Professor Snape added powdered moonstone to Mr. Potter's cauldron himself," she said finally, "and that the reaction was more violent than expected, implying it was expected to some degree. That was my interpretation as well." Narcissa folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "But there's something else, Madam Bones. Something that concerns me even more than this particular incident." "Go on." "Draco mentions that Mr. Potter has been having accidents in potions for years. He writes about it as though such things are commonplace, expected even. If a professor is willing to deliberately harm Harry Potter in front of a classroom full of witnesses, what might he be willing to do to other students when no one is watching?" Amelia set the letter down and studied Narcissa with the sort of careful evaluation that made the younger woman feel as though every expression was being catalogued and analyzed. "Mrs. Malfoy, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I need to understand your motivations here. Your family's associations during the war are well documented. Why would you come to the ministry to defend Harry Potter?" The question hung in the air between them, and Narcissa felt something settle in her chest, a clarity she hadn't realized she'd been seeking. "Because this isn't about Harry Potter, Madam Bones. This is about my son sitting in a classroom where the professor views students as acceptable targets for his anger. If Severus Snape is willing to poison the most famous student in magical Britain, what is he willing to do to a child whose parents won't be believed if they complain?" Something shifted in Amelia's expression, a recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that Narcissa's logic was sound, regardless of her family's political history. She reached for a different piece of parchment and began taking notes with the efficient movements of someone launching a formal investigation. "You mentioned that your son has written about previous incidents. Do you have other letters?" "I keep all of Draco's correspondence," Narcissa said, opening her handbag again. "I brought what I thought might be relevant." She placed a stack of letters on Amelia's desk, more than a dozen pieces of parchment dating back to Draco's 1st year. "I hadn't thought to read them with an investigative eye before yesterday, but when I reviewed them last night, patterns began to emerge." Amelia began reading through the letters with the methodical thoroughness that had made her reputation in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. As she progressed through nearly 4 years of Draco's correspondence, her expression grew increasingly grim. "This letter from his 2nd year," she said, holding up a piece of parchment covered in Draco's younger handwriting. He describes a Gryffindor student's potion exploding and burning the boy's hands badly enough to require treatment from Madame Pomfrey. He mentions that Professor Snape had been helping with the student's measurements just before the explosion. Yes, I noticed that as well. And here, from third year, a description of Mr. Potter being forced to restart his potion 3 times during a single class period because Professor Snape claimed to detect contamination that no one else could see. Amelia looked up from the letters. Mrs. Malfoy, how did your son write about these incidents? What was his tone? Narcissa considered the question carefully. Casual, amused even, as though such things were entertainment rather than cruelty. I don't think he understands what he's been witnessing, Madam Bones. He's been taught to view these incidents as normal parts of magical education. Amelia set the letters aside and leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled before her. Mrs. Malfoy, what you're describing suggests a pattern of deliberate abuse spanning multiple years. If these allegations prove accurate, we're not talking about a demanding professor or strict disciplinary measures. We're talking about systematic cruelty directed at children under the professor's care. That's exactly what I fear. I need to ask, have you discussed this matter with your husband, or with Professor Snape himself? Lucius is away on ministry business, Narcissa replied. And no, I haven't spoken to Severus. I wanted to bring this to proper authorities first. Amelia nodded approvingly. That was the right choice. If there is an investigation, it needs to be conducted without the subject being warned in advance. She reached for a fresh piece of parchment and began writing rapidly. I'm going to launch a formal inquiry into Professor Snape's teaching methods. I'll need to interview students, review academic records, and examine any complaints that may have been filed previously. You mentioned previous complaints? Informal ones. Parents who've expressed concerns about their children's treatment in potions classes, but who were told that Professor Snape's methods, while unorthodox, were within his authority as an educator. Amelia's expression darkened. I'm beginning to think we should have looked more closely at those complaints. Narcissa felt something loosen in her chest, relief, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of being believed. What can I do to help? Continue to be available for questions, and encourage your son to be honest about what he's witnessed. I'll be sending investigators to Hogwarts within the next few days. Amelia paused, her pen hovering over the parchment. Mrs. Malfoy, I need you to understand that once this investigation begins, there will be no way to contain it quietly. If Professor Snape is found guilty of the abuse you're describing, he will face criminal charges. The scandal will be public, and your family's involvement in bringing it to light will be known. I understand. Are you prepared for the consequences, the social pressures, the political ramifications? Narcissa thought of Draco's letter, of his casual description of another child's suffering, of the lessons he was learning in those dungeons about acceptable ways to treat people who couldn't fight back. She thought of the boy she wanted her son to become, and the man he might turn into if those lessons continued unchecked. Madam Bones, she said, her voice steady, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. My son is being taught that cruelty is acceptable as long as it's directed at the right targets. If I don't act to stop that, what kind of mother does that make me? What kind of person? Amelia smiled for the first time since the interview began, a small, approving expression that transformed her stern features. It makes you exactly the kind of person we need more of in the wizarding world, Mrs. Malfoy. She stood and extended her hand across the desk. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll be in contact within the next day or two with updates on our investigation. In the meantime, I'd like you to think carefully about anything else your son might have mentioned, any details that seemed insignificant at the time, but might be relevant to establishing a pattern. Narcissa shook the offered hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who had just committed to seeing justice done, regardless of the political complications. "I will. And Madam Bones, thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that this matters." "Children always matter, Mrs. Malfoy. They matter more than politics, more than old alliances, more than any adult's convenience." Amelia's expression grew fierce. "If someone has been hurting the students under their care, we will stop them. That's a promise." As Narcissa left the ministry building and stepped into the grey February afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in years. Behind her, she knew wheels were already turning, investigators being briefed, evidence being compiled, protections being put in place for the children who would need to testify about what they had witnessed and endured. For the first time since reading Draco's letter, she felt hopeful. Justice, it seemed, was more than just an abstract concept discussed in political theory. Sometimes it was as simple as a mother who cared more about protecting children than protecting the reputation of the adults who had failed them. The afternoon light was fading as she made her way back to the Flu Network, but Narcissa felt as though she were walking toward dawn rather than dusk. Tomorrow, Amelia Bones's investigators would arrive at Hogwarts, and the careful structure of silence and complicity that had allowed Severus Snape to brutalize children for years would finally begin to crumble. And Draco, her precious, complicated, impressionable son, would learn that some things mattered more than maintaining the status quo. He would learn that protecting the vulnerable was worth more than preserving old friendships, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with wands or politics, but with the simple courage to speak truth to power. It was a lesson worth the price they would all pay for it. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The great hall at dinner time was usually a sanctuary of warmth and chatter, filled with the comfortable sounds of hundreds of students sharing meals and gossip, while floating candles cast golden light over the 4 house tables. Tonight, however, the atmosphere shifted dramatically when the massive oak doors swung open to admit 3 figures in the deep blue robes of the Auror Corps. Harry Potter looked up from his shepherd's pie to see the newcomers stride purposefully down the central aisle between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables. Their leader, a stern-faced witch with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun, carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Behind her, 2 younger Aurors flanked her like an honor guard, their eyes scanning the hall with professional vigilance. The effect on the student body was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and hundreds of pairs of eyes tracked the Aura's progress toward the high table where the professors sat in their usual places. Even the ghosts seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Nearly headless. Nick had stopped his usual animated storytelling and now floated in respectful silence above the Gryffindor table. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy felt his stomach lurch with a recognition he couldn't quite name. Something about the Aura's purposeful movement, their complete lack of deference to the school's usual protocols, reminded him of his letter home 2 days ago. The casual words he'd written about Potter's collapse in potions suddenly felt less like amusing gossip and more like something that might have consequences he hadn't considered. Professor Dumbledore rose from his chair at the center of the high table, his movements as calm and measured as always. His blue eyes, however, held a sharpness that suggested he understood exactly why the Ministry had sent law enforcement to his school without advance notice. "Auror Proudfoot," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall. "Welcome to Hogwarts. How may we assist the Ministry this evening?" The lead Auror, Proudfoot apparently, stopped before the high table and inclined her head with professional courtesy. "Headmaster, we're here on official business regarding allegations of misconduct by a member of your faculty. We'll need to conduct interviews with students and staff, beginning this evening." The word misconduct rippled through the great hall like a stone thrown into still water. Students began whispering urgently to their neighbors, speculation building as they tried to guess which professor might have drawn ministry attention. At the Gryffindor table, Hermione Granger found herself thinking of every unfair detention, every point deducted for spurious reasons, every humiliation she'd witnessed in nearly 4 years at Hogwarts. Professor Snape, seated at Dumbledore's left hand, remained perfectly still, his black eyes fixed on the auras with an intensity that might have withered lesser mortals, but his expression betrayed nothing more than mild curiosity. Only someone who knew him well might have noticed the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his goblet. "Of course," Dumbledore replied smoothly. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation in my office? I'm sure we can resolve any misunderstandings without disrupting the students' evening meal." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Headmaster." Aura Proudfoot's tone remained respectfully firm. "Our investigation requires that we speak with potential witnesses while their memories are fresh, and without giving the subject time to prepare responses." The implications of her words sent another wave of tension through the hall. This wasn't a friendly inquiry or administrative review. This was a serious investigation conducted by people who believed a crime had been committed. Dumbledore's expression grew more serious. "Very well. Might I ask which member of my staff has drawn your attention?" "Professor Severus Snape," Proudfoot replied, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence that had fallen over the Great Hall. "We have credible allegations of systematic abuse of students under his care." The effect was immediate and dramatic. At the Slytherin table, several students gasped audibly. At the Gryffindor table, Harry felt his heart begin to race with something that might have been hope. Neville Longbottom, seated across from him, went very pale and began trembling slightly. Professor Snape rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his black robes billowing around him like the wings of some great predatory bird. When he spoke, his voice was silky and dangerous. "I see. And might I ask who has made these allegations?" "That information will be revealed during the formal proceedings," Proudfoot replied without flinching. "For now, we need you to remain available for questioning. You are not to leave the castle grounds." The dismissal in her tone, the casual assertion of ministry authority over a Hogwarts professor in his own domain, sent a shock through the assembled students that was almost physical. In 4 years, none of them had ever seen a teacher challenged so directly, so publicly. 20 miles away, Lucius Malfoy stood in the entrance hall of his ancestral home, travel dust still clinging to his expensive robes and a scroll of parchment clutched in his white-knuckled fist. The emergency message from a contact in the ministry had reached him just as his committee meetings were concluding, and he had abandoned his colleagues without explanation to race home through the Flu network. He found Narcissa in her sitting room, calmly working on her correspondence, as though she hadn't just destroyed one of their oldest alliances and potentially compromised their family's standing in wizarding society. She looked up as he entered, her expression composed but watchful. "Lucius," she said evenly, "you're home earlier than expected." "What?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Have you done?" Narcissa set down her quill and regarded him with the sort of calm that preceded either complete surrender or complete defiance. In 20 years of marriage, Lucius had learned to be wary of that particular expression. "I reported a pattern of child abuse to the proper authorities," she said. "Amelia Bones has launched a formal investigation into Severus Snape's teaching methods." The parchment in Lucius's hand crumpled as his fist clenched involuntarily. "You went to the ministry, without consulting me, without speaking to Severus, without considering the consequences for our family." "I considered our son's safety," Narcissa replied, rising from her chair with movements that radiated controlled tension. "I considered what kind of man he might become if he continues to learn that cruelty is acceptable entertainment. Severus Snape has been our ally for 15 years, Lucius's voice rose despite his efforts to maintain control. He stood as Draco's magical guardian. He has protected our interests advanced our causes, risked his own position to ensure that our son received proper treatment at that school. Proper treatment. Narcissa's voice carried a note of incredulity that made Lucius pause. Have you read Draco's letters, Lucius? Have you paid attention to what our son writes about his classes? The casual way he describes other children being hurt? The amusement he takes in their suffering? The boy needs to understand that the world is not a gentle place, Lucius snapped. Severus is preparing him for the realities of what? Narcissa interrupted. Of a world where might makes right? Where cruelty is justified if it's directed at acceptable targets? Where children learn to take pleasure in the pain of those weaker than themselves? She pulled Draco's latest letter from her robes and thrust it toward him. Read this, Lucius. Read how our 14-year-old son describes watching Harry Potter convulse from poisonous fumes. Read the casual way he mentions that such accidents happen regularly. Then tell me what you think Severus Snape is teaching him. Lucius took the letter with hands that trembled slightly from suppressed rage. As he read, his expression shifted from fury to confusion to something approaching horror. The clinical detachment with which Draco described another child's suffering, the amused tone in which he recounted deliberate cruelty, the complete lack of empathy or concern. It was like reading the thoughts of a stranger. This is, he began, then stopped, rereading certain passages as though he might have misunderstood them the first time. This is our son, Narcissa said quietly. This is who he's becoming under Severus Snape's guidance. Is this the man you want him to be? Lucius sank into the chair across from hers, the letter still clutched in his hands. For a moment, he looked older than his 40 years, worn down by the weight of choices made and consequences that hadn't been considered until it was too late to change course. What you've done, he said finally, his voice hoarse. The investigation, the public scandal, it will destroy Severus. It will destroy us. When it comes out that the complaint originated with you. Let it, Narcissa said fiercely. Let them ostracize us. Let them whisper and point and exclude us from their precious social gatherings. At least our son will grow up understanding that some things matter more than maintaining appearances. You don't understand what you've risked, Lucius said desperately. Our position in society, our business relationships, our political influence, all of it depends on maintaining the right alliances. If we're seen as traitors to our own class, our own people, Narcissa repeated slowly. Is that what we call them? The ones who think it's acceptable to torture children as long as those children are from the wrong families. Back at Hogwarts, the Great Hall had finally begun to empty as students reluctantly returned to their dormitories, though clusters of whispered conversations could be seen throughout the corridors as news of the investigation spread. In a classroom that had been hastily converted into an interview room, Aura Proudfoot sat across from a nervous-looking third-year Hufflepuff whose hand shook as she recounted her experiences in potions classes. He always made me redo my cutting, the girl whispered. Said I was too slow, too clumsy, that I'd never amount to anything if I couldn't follow simple instructions. But the thing is, I'd measured everything exactly right the first time. I kept notes, you see, and when I compared them with my housemates. Proudfoot made careful notations on her parchment, her expression professionally neutral, despite the anger building in her chest. 3 interviews in, and already the pattern was clear. Systematic intimidation, deliberate sabotage, psychological cruelty, disguised as educational rigor. In the Gryffindor common room, Harry Potter sat in stunned silence as his fellow students shared stories that painted a picture far darker than even he had realized. Neville's experiences were the worst, years of deliberate humiliation, dangerous accidents that could have killed him, constant psychological abuse that had convinced him he was worthless at magic. I thought it was just me, Neville whispered, tears streaming down his face. I thought I deserved it, because I was so hopeless at potions. But if they're investigating, "It means you were never the problem," Hermione said fiercely, her arm around his shoulders. "It means someone finally listened when we tried to tell them what was happening." And in the dungeons, Professor Severus Snape sat alone in his office, staring at the letter of formal complaint that had been delivered an hour ago. The careful, damning words that outlined 4 years of documented cruelty, witnessed by dozens of students and corroborated by multiple sources. He recognized the writing style, the particular phrases and cadences that could only belong to one person. Narcissa Black had done this. Narcissa, whose son he had protected and favored since the boy's first day at Hogwarts. Narcissa, whose family he had considered allies, friends, worthy of his loyalty and protection. The betrayal cut deeper than he had expected. But beneath the hurt and rage, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps he had given her no choice. Perhaps he had become exactly the sort of man who deserved to be brought down by the mother of a child he had failed to protect from himself. Chapter 5. Witnesses emerge. The makeshift interview room on the 2nd floor had been chosen for its distance from the dungeons, far enough, or Proudfoot hoped, that students would feel safe speaking honestly about their experiences. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed inadequate to dispel the shadows that 4 years of systematic cruelty had cast over these children's education. Hermione Granger sat across from Proudfoot with a thick stack of notebooks in her lap, her hand steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. At 14, she possessed the kind of methodical intelligence that made her an investigator's dream witness, someone who had not only observed patterns, but had documented them with scholarly precision. "I started keeping detailed notes in my 2nd year," Hermione began, her voice clear and determined. "Initially, it was just to track my own progress in each subject, but I began to notice discrepancies in Professor Snape's grading practices." She opened the first notebook and turned it toward Proudfoot, revealing pages of neat handwriting organized into careful columns. "These are my potions grades compared to equivalent work in other subjects. I received an acceptable on a strengthening solution that Madame Pomfrey later praised as expertly brewed when she used it in the hospital wing. The same week, I received outstanding marks in transfiguration and charms for work that required similar precision and theoretical understanding." Proudfoot examined the meticulously maintained records, noting dates, assignments, and detailed descriptions of each potion's preparation and results. "You documented everything?" "Everything I could observe," Hermione confirmed, "including incidents involving other students. I hoped that if someone ever asked for evidence, I could provide it." She flipped through several pages, pointing to specific entries. "Here, October 15th, 1993. Neville Longbottom's shrinking solution was prepared correctly according to the textbook instructions, but Professor Snape added ingredients after Neville finished brewing. When the potion turned toxic and began eating through the cauldron, Professor Snape blamed Neville for poor preparation and gave him detention." "You witnessed Professor Snape adding ingredients to a student's completed work?" "Multiple times." Hermione's voice carried a weight beyond her years. "Always to Gryffindor students' potions, and always in ways that caused the potion to fail dramatically. He would then use the failure as justification for punishment and humiliation." Proudfoot made careful notes, then looked up at the girl whose testimony was systematically destroying any possibility that these incidents were isolated mistakes. "Miss Granger, why didn't you report this behavior to other faculty members?" Hermione's composure wavered slightly. "I tried once. In my 2nd year, I approached Professor McGonagall after a particularly bad incident involving Harry. She listened, but she said that Professor Snape's classroom was his domain, and that different professors had different teaching styles. She suggested I focus on my own work and not worry about how others were being treated." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Proudfoot felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the rage that came from discovering that institutions designed to protect children had instead enabled their abuse through willful blindness. An hour later, Neville Longbottom sat in the same chair, his hands trembling as he struggled to find words for experiences that had shaped him more than any spell or potion ever could. Professor McGonagall sat beside him at his request, her presence offering the support he needed to speak truths he had never dared voice aloud. "I used to have nightmares about potions class," Neville whispered, his voice barely audible. "I would wake up in a cold sweat, sometimes crying, because I was so afraid of making another mistake. But the thing is, I don't think they were always mistakes." He looked up at Proudfoot with eyes that held too much pain for someone his age. "There was this time in second year when I was brewing a simple cure for boils. I followed every instruction exactly. Hermione had helped me practice the night before, and I knew I had everything right. But when Professor Snape came to check my work, he stirred my potion counterclockwise." McGonagall's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. "The textbook said clockwise only," Neville continued. "Everyone knows that. But he stirred it the wrong way, and then, when it started bubbling over and burning my hands, he screamed at me for being incompetent, said I was a disgrace to my parents' memory." McGonagall's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Neville, did Professor Snape often reference your parents?" "All the time." The words came out in a rush now, as though a dam had burst. He'd say things like, "It's no wonder your parents ended up the way they did, with a son who can't brew a simple potion," or, "Perhaps if you had half your mother's talent instead of inheriting her weakness." He made it sound like what happened to them was their fault, and that I was going to end up the same way because I was too stupid to... His voice broke, and McGonagall's hand moved to his shoulder in a gesture of protection that should have been unnecessary within the walls of Hogwarts. "Professor Snape knew about your parents' condition?" Proudfoot asked gently. "Everyone knows," Neville said miserably. "But most people don't. They don't use it to hurt me. Professor Snape did it deliberately. He knew exactly which words would cause the most pain." McGonagall's expression had shifted from concern to something approaching fury. "In 14 years of teaching," she said carefully, "I have never used a student's personal tragedy as a weapon against them. The fact that a colleague would deliberately inflict such psychological cruelty..." She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Some lines should never be crossed, and Severus Snape had not merely crossed them, but obliterated them entirely. Harry Potter's interview came in the afternoon, and he proved to be a more reluctant witness than the others. He sat stiffly in his chair, his famous green eyes guarded, as he answered Proudfoot's questions with the minimum necessary detail. "Everyone knows Professor Snape doesn't like me," he said, when pressed about the pattern of treatment he'd received. "I just assumed it was personal." "Can you give me specific examples of this treatment?" Harry shifted uncomfortably. "He's always taking points from Gryffindor when I'm in his class. Sometimes for things that aren't actually wrong. Like when my potion comes out exactly the right color, but he says it's too pale. Or when I answer a question correctly, but he says I was showing off. What about the incident that was reported to us? When you collapsed during class?" For the first time, Harry's composure cracked slightly. "That wasn't the first time something like that happened. There was another time, in second year, when he added something to my cauldron, and the fumes made me dizzy. I thought I was going to be sick, but he just told me to pay better attention to ventilation." Proudfoot leaned forward. "Mr. Potter, do you understand that what you're describing constitutes deliberate harm? That a professor adding unknown substances to a student's work isn't normal teaching practice?" Harry looked genuinely surprised by the question. I thought all the professors were allowed to do whatever they wanted in their classrooms. Professor Snape is head of Slytherin House, and everyone says he's brilliant at potions. so I assumed he must know what he was doing. The casual acceptance in his voice, the assumption that adult authority figures were automatically justified in their cruelty, made Proudfoot's chest tighten with professional anger. How many children had been taught to normalize abuse simply because it came from someone in a position of power? By evening, Professor McGonagall had heard enough testimony to feel physically ill. She sat in her office with a cup of tea, growing cold in her hands, staring at the stack of interview transcripts that Aura Proudfoot had shared with her. 4 years of documented cruelty, psychological abuse, and deliberate endangerment of children under her own roof. Children she had failed to protect. Ron Weasley's testimony about systematic bias against students from families Snape considered unworthy. Seamus Finnegan's account of a potion explosion that had left him with burns requiring 3 days of treatment, burns that occurred after Snape had corrected his perfectly adequate brewing technique. Dean Thomas's description of being forced to clean cauldrons with his bare hands after Snape had deliberately contaminated them with irritating substances. The pattern was clear, undeniable, and absolutely damning, and McGonagall had been blind to all of it. Not blind, worse. She had been willfully ignorant, choosing to believe that Snape's harshness was within acceptable bounds, because addressing it would have been inconvenient, politically complicated, and personally uncomfortable. She had prioritized institutional harmony over student welfare, and the children had paid the price. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her self-recrimination. "Come in." Hermione Granger entered, looking older than her 14 years and carrying herself with the gravity of someone who had just helped expose a years-long conspiracy of institutional neglect. "Professor McGonagall, I wanted to ask, what happens now?" McGonagall set down her teacup and looked at the student who had just demonstrated more moral courage than most of the Hogwarts faculty. "Now, Miss Granger, we face the consequences of our failures, and we do everything in our power to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. Will Professor Snape be arrested? If the evidence supports criminal charges, then yes, he will face justice through proper legal channels." McGonagall's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "And there will be changes to how this school operates, oversight that should have existed from the beginning, protections for students that should never have been necessary, but clearly are." Hermione nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about all the times I wanted to say something but didn't. All the times I told myself it wasn't my business, or that adults must know better than I did." "You were a child," McGonagall said gently. "Children should never have to be the ones to police adult behavior. That responsibility belonged to the faculty, to the administration, to everyone who should have been paying attention, but wasn't." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds where students were returning from their evening activities. "You've been braver than any of us, Miss Granger. You and Mr. Longbottom and Mr. Potter and all the others who found the courage to speak truth to power. You've done what we should have done years ago." As Hermione left her office, McGonagall remained at the window, watching the children under her care and making a silent promise that she would spend whatever remained of her career ensuring that no student would ever again suffer in silence while the adults around them chose convenience over courage. The investigation would continue, charges would likely be filed, and the scandal would reshape Hogwarts in ways that would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. But perhaps discomfort was exactly what they all deserved, and what the children in their care had needed all along. Chapter 6. Dumbledore's Choice. The headmaster's office felt smaller than usual with Amelia Bones sitting across from Dumbledore's desk, her presence radiating the kind of professional authority that could not be charmed away with offered sweets or gentle deflection. The portraits of former headmasters watched from their frames with unusual stillness, as though even they understood that this conversation would determine the future of Hogwarts itself. Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled before him, his blue eyes lacking their usual twinkle as he regarded the witch who had just spent 3 days systematically dismantling one of his faculty members' reputation. Between them lay a thick folder of witness statements, interview transcripts, and documented evidence that painted a picture of institutional failure so comprehensive that even his considerable political skill might not be sufficient to contain the damage. "Amelia," he began, his voice carrying its customary warmth despite the circumstances, "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter with me, personally, before proceeding with formal charges. I'm certain we can reach an understanding that serves everyone's interests. I'm not here to negotiate, Albus." Amelia's tone was crisp and professional, cutting through his diplomatic overtures with surgical precision. "I'm here to give you an opportunity to explain how Professor Snape's documented pattern of child abuse was allowed to continue for 4 years under your direct supervision." Dumbledore's expression grew more serious, though he maintained the measured calm that had served him through decades of political maneuvering. "Severus can indeed be demanding in his teaching methods. However, I think it's important to consider the context in which he operates. Potions is an inherently dangerous subject, and maintaining strict discipline is essential for student safety." "Strict discipline," Amelia repeated slowly, opening the folder before her. "Is that what you call deliberately adding toxic ingredients to a student's correctly prepared potion? Forcing a child to handle caustic substances with bare hands? Using a student's family tragedy as psychological warfare?" Each accusation landed with the weight of documented truth, and Dumbledore found himself in the unfamiliar position of defending the indefensible. "Severus has always been intense in his dedication to his subject. Perhaps his methods are unorthodox, but his methods are criminal," Amelia interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "And you've known about them for years." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond a single problematic professor. Dumbledore regarded her with the sort of careful evaluation he usually reserved for the most delicate political negotiations. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, Amelia." "Don't!" The single word carried enough authority to make even Albus Dumbledore pause. "Don't insult my intelligence or my investigation by pretending ignorance. We've documented 17 separate complaints about Professor Snape's behavior that were brought to your attention over the past 4 years. 17 times parents or students came to you with concerns about his treatment of children under his care, and 17 times you dismissed those concerns without investigation." Dumbledore's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his wand, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Those complaints were largely subjective interpretations of pedagogical techniques. Different families have different expectations regarding academic rigor." "Academic rigor," Amelia said, her voice dripping with disgust. "Is that what you call it when Professor McGonagall filed a formal memo expressing concern about a student who was having nightmares about potions class? When Madame Pomfrey documented 17 separate visits to the hospital wing for injuries that occurred during Professor Snape's classes, injuries that happened to students whose work had been corrected by the professor himself?" For the first time since the conversation began, Dumbledore's composure showed signs of strain. "You've spoken with Minerva and Poppy." "I've spoken with everyone, Albus, including the staff members who tried to bring these problems to your attention, and were told that Professor Snape's classroom management was not their concern." Amelia leaned forward, her eyes boring into his with prosecutorial intensity. "The question I keep asking myself is why? Why would the great Albus Dumbledore, champion of children's rights and defender of the innocent, consistently choose to protect a teacher who was systematically abusing the students under his care?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of secrets that Dumbledore had spent years carefully concealing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that aged him beyond his considerable years. "Severus Snape is valuable to me in ways that extend beyond his role as a potions instructor." "Elaborate." I'm afraid I cannot be more specific about the nature of his service. Suffice it to say that his continued presence at Hogwarts serves purposes that you might consider more important than his teaching methodology. Amelia's expression grew thunderous. Are you seriously suggesting that whatever other role Professor Snape plays in your schemes justifies 4 years of documented child abuse? I'm suggesting that the world is more complicated than it might appear from the perspective of law enforcement, Dumbledore replied, his tone carrying a hint of the condescension that had irritated ministry officials for decades. There are larger considerations at stake. Larger than the welfare of children? The question landed with devastating simplicity, and for a moment Dumbledore found himself without a ready answer. In 40 years of leading Hogwarts, he had grown accustomed to being the wisest voice in any room, the moral authority whose judgment was rarely questioned. The idea that his carefully balanced priorities might be fundamentally wrong was not one he was prepared to entertain. The greater good sometimes requires difficult choices, he said finally. The greater good, Amelia repeated, her voice carrying a note of incredulity that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Albus, you've just admitted to me that you knowingly allowed children to be tortured because it was convenient for your political agenda. Do you understand what that makes you? Dumbledore's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. I have spent my entire life fighting dark wizards and protecting the innocent. Every decision I make is calculated to serve the cause of justice, and justice! Amelia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. You want to talk about justice? Let me tell you about justice. Justice is 14-year-old Neville Longbottom finally sleeping through the night because he doesn't have to face his abuser tomorrow morning. Justice is Harry Potter learning that adult authority figures who hurt children face consequences for their actions. Justice is every parent in magical Britain knowing that their children are safe in their classrooms. She placed both hands on his desk, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had spent her career defending the vulnerable. What you've allowed to happen here isn't justice, Albus. It's not the greater good. It's moral cowardice disguised as strategic thinking. Dumbledore rose from his chair, his considerable height allowing him to look down at her, with something approaching his former authority. You don't understand the complexities of the situation. I understand that you've lost perspective, Amelia shot back. You've become so focused on your grand strategies that you've forgotten the most basic responsibility of anyone in charge of children, keeping them safe from harm. And what would you have me do? Dumbledore's voice carried a note of genuine frustration. Remove Severus and compromise operations that could affect the safety of the entire wizarding world? I would have you remember that the wizarding world is made up of individuals, children whose welfare should matter more than your political chess games. Amelia straightened, her professional composure returning as she shifted into her role as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But it's too late for that conversation, isn't it? Because Professor Snape will be arrested tomorrow morning on charges of child abuse, assault, and criminal negligence. The colour drained from Dumbledore's face. Amelia, surely we can reach some accommodation. The time for accommodation passed when you chose to protect an abuser over the children he was hurting. She gathered her files with movements that radiated finality. Professor Snape will face trial, and if convicted, he will serve time in Azkaban. Your cooperation in that process is expected, but not required. This will destroy him, Dumbledore said quietly. Good. The single word carried all the weight of 3 days spent listening to children describe years of systematic cruelty. Perhaps he should have thought of that before he chose to terrorize students whose only crime was being sorted into the wrong house. Amelia moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to face the man who had just revealed himself to be far less than the legend suggested. Albus, you'll be receiving formal notice tomorrow that the Ministry is launching a comprehensive review of Hogwarts governance and oversight procedures. The days of this school operating without accountability, are over. The Wizengamot will never. The Wizengamot has already been briefed on our findings, Amelia interrupted. Funny thing about child abuse. It tends to transcend political loyalties. Even your staunchest supporters are having trouble justifying 4 years of documented cruelty. As the door closed behind her, Dumbledore sank back into his chair and stared at the folder of evidence she had left behind. 40 years of building political capital, carefully cultivating relationships, and positioning himself as the moral center of magical Britain. All of it potentially destroyed by his refusal to see that some prices were too high to pay, even for the greater good. Fawkes trilled softly from his perch, a sound that might have been comfort or reproach. In the growing dusk, surrounded by the portraits of predecessors who had never faced such a comprehensive challenge to their authority, Albus Dumbledore contemplated the possibility that his greatest failure had not been in his battles against dark wizards, but in his willingness to become one himself in service of what he had convinced himself was righteousness. Outside his office, Hogwarts continued its ancient rhythms, but everything had changed. By tomorrow, the entire wizarding world would know that the school's greatest protector had chosen to protect the wrong people, and that children had paid the price for his moral blindness. The greater good, it seemed, had always been more complicated than he had allowed himself to believe. Chapter 7. The Daily Prophet. The headline screamed across the front page of the Daily Prophet in letters so bold they seemed to vibrate with their own outrage. Hogwarts horror, years of child abuse covered up by Dumbledore. Beneath it, Rita Skeeter's byline promised the kind of exposé that would dominate wizarding conversation for months to come. In the leaky cauldron, the usual morning bustle had given way to clusters of witches and wizards huddled over their copies of the paper, voices rising in disbelief and anger as they read the meticulously documented accounts of systematic cruelty. Tom the barkeeper had stopped serving breakfast altogether, too absorbed in his own copy to notice that half his customers' eggs had gone cold. "Listen to this," gasped a witch in emerald robes, reading aloud to her companion. According to ministry sources, Professor Severus Snape deliberately contaminated student potions with toxic substances, causing at least 3 hospitalizations and numerous injuries over the past 4 years. When confronted with evidence of these incidents, Headmaster Dumbledore reportedly dismissed parent complaints as subjective interpretations of pedagogical techniques. Her companion, a wizard with greying hair and the worn robes of someone who worked for his living, shook his head in disgust. "My daughter graduated from Hogwarts 2 years ago. She used to come home for holidays looking like she'd been through a war. Said potions was challenging. But this..." He gestured at the newspaper with trembling hands. This explained so much. Across magical Britain, similar scenes played out in every public house, ministry office, and family home. The story that Rita Skeeter had crafted from leaked investigation documents and strategically obtained interviews painted a picture of institutional failure so complete that even Dumbledore's most ardent supporters found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about Hogwarts. At Malfoy Manor, Lucius stood in his study reading the article for the 3rd time, each pass revealing new details that made his family's position more precarious. The prophet had been careful not to name Narcissa directly, referring only to a concerned parent whose courageous decision to contact authorities may have saved countless children from further abuse. But the wizarding world was small, and gossip traveled faster than owl post. By noon, he would need to have answers ready for colleagues who would demand to know why his wife had chosen to expose one of their own allies. By evening, he would need to decide whether to publicly support Narcissa's actions or attempt to distance the family from the growing scandal. The decision was made for him when he heard the distinctive crack of apparition from the front garden, followed by the urgent voices of reporters who had somehow bypassed his estate's protective wards. Through his study window, he could see at least 6 journalists with quick quotes quills hovering eagerly above parchment, their faces bright with the anticipation of blood in the water. "Mrs. Malfoy," one of them called out, her voice magically amplified to carry across the grounds. "Can you comment on your role in exposing Professor Snape's alleged crimes?" Lucius closed his eyes and prepared himself for the inevitable conversation with his wife. They had spent 20 years building their reputation, cultivating the right connections, positioning themselves among the most influential families in magical society. One morning's newspaper could destroy it all. He found Narcissa in her sitting room, dressed in her finest robes, and sitting with the serene composure of someone who had already made peace with the consequences of her choices. She looked up as he entered, and he saw no trace of regret in her expression. "They're calling for a statement," he said without preamble. "Then I suppose I should give them one. Narcissa, think about what you're doing. Once you speak publicly, there's no taking it back. Our position in society, our business relationships, will survive or they won't," she interrupted calmly. "But our son will grow up knowing that his mother chose his safety over social convenience." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gathered reporters with something that might have been satisfaction. "I'm going to tell them exactly why I reported Severus Snape. I'm going to tell them about Draco's letters, about the pattern of abuse I discovered, about my choice to protect children over protecting adults who had failed in their duty." Lucius felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You'll be ostracized. We both will." "Perhaps," Narcissa agreed. "Or perhaps other parents will realize that their children's safety is more important than maintaining old loyalties. Perhaps some good will come from all of this." She moved toward the door with purposeful strides, and Lucius found himself following, despite his better judgment. At the front entrance, she paused and turned to face him. "You can stand beside me, or you can distance yourself from my actions," she said quietly. "I won't force you to share the consequences of choices I made, but I won't apologize for those choices either." At Hogwarts, the Morning Owl Post had brought an unprecedented deluge of howler letters that filled the Great Hall with a cacophony of parental rage. The red envelopes burst open in sequence, each one releasing another torrent of fury that had been building since the prophet hit breakfast tables across Britain. "How dare you allow my child to be tortured?" screamed one letter in the unmistakable voice of Mrs. Bones, though her daughter Susan had graduated the previous year. 4 years! 4 years of complaints ignored. Withdraw my son immediately," bellowed another. "If you cannot protect children from your own staff, you have no right to call yourself educators." Professor McGonagall sat at the high table, watching the spectacle with growing horror. Each howler represented a family whose trust they had betrayed, a child whose suffering they had failed to prevent. The magnitude of their institutional failure was becoming impossible to deny or minimize. Beside her, Professor Flitwick looked physically ill. "Minerva," he whispered, barely audible over the continuing barrage of angry voices. "How many families are we going to lose over this?" Before she could answer, yet another howler exploded with particular venom. "My daughter came home crying every holiday. She begged us not to send her back to potions. We told her to be stronger. We blamed her for not trying harder. We should have listened." That letter seemed to break something in McGonagall's composure. She rose abruptly from her seat and strode from the hall, unable to listen to another word of well-deserved condemnation. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy sat in stunned silence as his housemates whispered furiously around him. Everyone knew by now that his family was connected to the scandal, though the exact nature of his mother's involvement remained unclear. The looks he was receiving ranged from curious to accusatory, and he found himself wondering if this was what it felt like to be Harry Potter. Constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly held responsible for circumstances beyond his control. "My father's furious," Pansy Parkinson hissed in his ear. "Says your mother has destroyed everything our family's worked for. Says she chose the wrong side." Draco turned to look at her, seeing for the first time the casual cruelty that had always been there beneath her perfectly groomed exterior. The wrong side? Obviously. Snape was one of us, and she fed him to the ministry like some common criminal. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how fundamentally different his perspective had become from those of his former friends. A week ago, he might have agreed with Pansy's assessment. Now, all he could think about were the details in his own letters, details he had written about Harry Potter's suffering with the same casual amusement Pansy was showing now. In the Ministry of Magic, Cornelius Fudge paced his office while an emergency session of the Wizengamot convened in the chambers below. The political calculations that usually guided his decisions had become impossibly complex. Supporting Dumbledore meant defending child abuse, but challenging him meant acknowledging that the ministry had failed in its oversight responsibilities. "Minister," his secretary announced through the flue. "The Wizengamot is ready for your statement." Fudge straightened his robes and prepared to face the most difficult political crisis of his career. Outside his office, he could hear the sounds of protesters who had gathered in the ministry's atrium, parents demanding justice, children's rights advocates calling for reform, and reporters documenting every moment for the next day's headlines. The scandal had grown beyond anything that could be contained through political maneuvering or careful spin. The public had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, and reached their own conclusions about what had happened at Hogwarts and who was responsible for allowing it to continue. As Fudge made his way to the Wizengamot chambers, he reflected on how quickly everything had changed. A week ago, Albus Dumbledore had been the most respected wizard in Britain. Hogwarts had been considered the pinnacle of magical education, and the Malfoy family had been minor players in a quiet political game. Now Dumbledore's moral authority lay in ruins. Hogwarts faced a crisis of confidence that threatened its very existence, and Narcissa Malfoy had become the most talked-about witch in Wizarding Britain, not for her family connections or social standing, but for her willingness to choose children's welfare over adult convenience. The transformation was remarkable, and Fudge found himself wondering which version of events would be remembered by history: the careful, political narratives he had spent his career crafting, or the simple moral clarity of a mother who had decided that some things mattered more than maintaining the status quo. Outside the chamber doors, the sounds of protest continued, and Fudge steeled himself for the conversation that would determine not just his political future, but the future of magical education itself. The age of unquestioned authority was ending, and something new, something more accountable, more transparent, and more protective of the vulnerable would have to take its place. Whether he helped build that future or became an obstacle to it would depend entirely on the choices he made in the next few hours. Chapter 8. The Hearing. The Wizengamot chamber had not seen such crowds since the trials following Voldemort's first fall. Every seat in the public gallery was occupied, with overflow crowds spilling into the corridors outside, as parents, students, reporters, and concerned citizens gathered to witness what many were calling the most important hearing in modern magical education. The ancient chamber, with its tiered seating and imposing stone architecture, seemed to vibrate with anticipation as Chief Warlock Dumbledore took his place at the center of the crescent-shaped bench. The irony was not lost on anyone present that Albus Dumbledore would be presiding over proceedings that would likely result in his own formal censure. His blue eyes, usually twinkling with warmth, appeared dim behind his half-moon spectacles as he surveyed the packed chamber with the weary expression of someone who understood that his reputation would not survive the day intact. "The Wizengamot will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite its subdued tone. "We are here to consider formal charges against Professor Severus Snape of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, brought by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The accused stands charged with systematic child abuse, assault, and criminal negligence in the performance of his duties." Professor Snape sat in the defendant's chair at the center of the chamber, his black robes billowing around him like the wings of some great predatory bird. His expression remained coldly impassive as Dumbledore read the charges, though those seated close enough could see the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed the rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Amelia Bones rose from her seat among the ministry prosecutors, a thick folder of evidence in her hands, and the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent weeks building an unassailable case. Chief Warlock, members of the Wizengamot, what we will present today is not a case of isolated incidents or pedagogical disagreements. What we will prove is a pattern of systematic cruelty spanning 4 years, enabled by institutional negligence and protected by administrative indifference. She gestured toward the public gallery, where dozens of current and former Hogwarts students sat with their families. The victims of Professor Snape's abuse are here today, ready to speak their truth. Their courage in coming forward has exposed a failure of protection so complete that it demands not just individual accountability, but systemic reform. The first witness called was Hermione Granger, who approached the witness stand with her familiar stack of notebooks and the determined expression of someone who had been preparing for this moment since her second year. At 14, she looked impossibly young in the formal setting, but her voice was steady and clear as she began to recount 4 years of documented abuse. I have recorded over 40 separate incidents of Professor Snape deliberately sabotaging student work, she testified, opening her notebooks to reveal pages of meticulous documentation. Not correcting mistakes or providing guidance, but actively adding ingredients or altering procedures in ways designed to cause potions to fail catastrophically. She turned to a specific page, her finger tracing down the careful columns of dates and descriptions. November 3rd, 1993. Neville Longbottom's shrinking solution was prepared according to textbook specifications. Professor Snape added powdered moonstone while Neville was cleaning his workspace. The resulting explosion sent Neville to the hospital wing with chemical burns on his hands and arms. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as parents recognized the clinical precision of her testimony. This was not the emotional outcry of an upset student, but the methodical presentation of documented evidence by someone who understood the difference between strict teaching and deliberate cruelty. Professor Snape's defense counsel, a thin wizard with nervous hands who had clearly drawn the short straw in representing such an unpopular case, rose to object. Chief Warlock, this witness is a child making accusations about adult authority figures. Her interpretations of classroom incidents cannot be considered reliable evidence. The witness is presenting documented observations, not interpretations, Amelia replied smoothly. Her notebooks have been reviewed by independent potions masters who confirm that the incidents she describes constitute deliberate sabotage, not pedagogical correction. When Neville Longbottom took the witness stand, the chamber fell into absolute silence. His voice shook as he began to speak, but the words that emerged painted a picture of psychological torture that left even the most hardened Wizengamot members visibly disturbed. Professor Snape used to tell me I was killing my parents all over again, Neville whispered, tears streaming down his face. He said that every mistake I made in his classroom proved that they had died for nothing, that their son was too weak and stupid to honor their sacrifice. The gasps from the gallery were audible, but Neville continued with the courage of someone who had finally found his voice. He knew what happened to my parents. Everyone knows. But he used it as a weapon against me, over and over, for years. He made me believe that their condition was somehow my fault, that I was responsible for their suffering. Professor McGonagall, seated in the section reserved for Hogwarts faculty, had gone completely pale. Beside her, Professor Flitwick looked physically ill as the scope of his colleague's cruelty became clear. When Harry Potter was called to testify, the chamber grew so quiet that the sound of his footsteps seemed to echo like thunder. At 14, the boy who lived had learned to handle public attention with careful composure, but standing before the Wizengamot to testify against a professor was unlike any challenge he had previously faced. "Professor Snape hated me from the first day of classes," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I thought it was because of my father, or because I was famous, or because I was in Gryffindor. I never realized until recently that what he was doing was actually illegal." He described years of targeted harassment, deliberate humiliation, and the incident that had prompted Narcissa Malfoy to contact the authorities. "When I collapsed in potions class, I thought it was my fault. Professor Snape told me it was my fault. It wasn't until the investigators explained what had actually happened that I understood he had poisoned me deliberately." The simplicity of his testimony, the matter-of-fact way he described normalizing abuse because it came from an adult in authority, seemed to affect the Wizengamot more than dramatic accusations might have. Here was a child who had accepted cruelty as normal because no adult had ever told him he deserved better. The surprise testimony came from parents whose children had graduated from Hogwarts in previous years. Mrs. Clearwater, whose daughter Penelope had left Hogwarts after her 6th year, stood before the Wizengamot with documentation that made Amelia's case even stronger. "My daughter transferred to Beauxbatons Academy in her final year," she testified, her voice shaking with anger. She had been planning to pursue advanced potions to qualify for healer training, but after 5 years of Professor Snape's treatment, she was too traumatized to continue. Her career ambitions were destroyed by a teacher who should have been nurturing her talents. She was followed by 2 other parents whose children had also transferred schools, each one describing the same pattern, promising students whose educational goals had been derailed by systematic psychological abuse disguised as academic rigor. When Professor McGonagall took the witness stand, her testimony proved to be among the most damaging. As deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, her words carried institutional weight that no parent or student testimony could match. "I filed 17 separate reports with the headmaster regarding Professor Snape's treatment of students," she testified, her voice tight with controlled emotion. 17 formal complaints about incidents that I witnessed personally or that were reported to me by students in my care. Every single report was dismissed without investigation." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs, quickly silenced by Dumbledore's call for order. McGonagall continued with the devastating precision of someone who had spent weeks reviewing her own failures. "I have served as deputy headmistress for over 30 years. In that time, I have never seen such systematic disregard for student welfare by a faculty member, nor such willful blindness to documented abuse by school administration. What happened to these children was not education. It was torture, enabled by institutional cowardice." When Professor Snape finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness despite the mountain of evidence against him. He stood with rigid posture, his black eyes scanning the chamber with undisguised contempt for the proceedings. "I have spent 14 years preparing young wizards and witches for a world that will show them no mercy," he declared, his voice carrying the silky menace that had terrorized students for years. "Potions is a dangerous subject, requiring absolute precision and unwavering discipline. Students who cannot meet those standards have no business pursuing careers that might put lives at risk." His defense counsel had clearly advised him to show remorse or acknowledge mistakes, but Snape seemed incapable of such humility. "If certain students found my methods challenging, then perhaps they learned valuable lessons about their own limitations. The weak are weeded out in my classroom before they can endanger others through their incompetence." The calculated cruelty in his words, delivered without a trace of regret or recognition of wrongdoing, seemed to seal his fate more effectively than any prosecution argument could have managed. Even Wizengamot members who had entered the hearing with sympathy for a fellow educator found themselves recoiling from his complete lack of empathy for the children he had terrorized. When Narcissa Malfoy testified about her decision to report Snape's behavior, her testimony provided the emotional capstone to the prosecution's case. Dressed in formal robes that emphasized her status while maintaining appropriate solemnity, she spoke with the quiet dignity of someone whose conscience had compelled her to act despite personal cost. "When I read my son's letter describing Harry Potter's collapse," she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "I realized that Professor Snape was teaching my child to view cruelty as entertainment, that a teacher's deliberate harm of students was something to be amused by rather than horrified by." She turned to look directly at Professor Snape, her blue eyes holding steady despite the hatred radiating from his direction. "I reported Professor Snape's behavior because I could not allow my son to continue learning that the strong have the right to torture the weak, because I could not stand by while children suffered in silence, convinced they deserved the cruelty being inflicted upon them." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, "We tell our children to respect authority, to trust the adults responsible for their education. Professor Snape perverted that trust, using his position to inflict deliberate harm on vulnerable students. If we do not hold such people accountable, we become complicit in their crimes." The deliberation was brief. After less than an hour of discussion, Chief Warlock Dumbledore returned to announce verdicts that would reshape magical education in Britain. "The Wizengamot finds Professor Severus Snape guilty on all charges," he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of institutional failure. "He is hereby sentenced to 2 years in Azkaban, permanent removal from any teaching position, and prohibition from unsupervised contact with minors." The chamber erupted in applause from the gallery, quickly silenced as Dumbledore continued with the second part of the proceedings. "Furthermore, this body formally censures Headmaster Albus Dumbledore for gross negligence in his oversight responsibilities, willful blindness to documented abuse, and failure to protect the students under his care. Effective immediately, Hogwarts School will operate under direct ministry oversight until comprehensive reforms can be implemented." As auras moved to escort Professor Snape from the chamber, he turned for one final look at the students whose testimony had destroyed him. His black eyes held no remorse, no recognition of the harm he had caused, only rage at being held accountable for actions he still believed were justified. But for the first time in 4 years, the children he had terrorized watched him leave without fear. They had spoken their truth, been believed, and seen justice done. The nightmares would continue. The psychological scars would take time to heal. But they would never again be told that their suffering was acceptable as long as it served someone else's vision of education. In the gallery, parents who had blamed their children for academic struggles began to understand how thoroughly they had been deceived. Students who had internalized shame about their perceived failures started to recognize that they had been victims of systematic abuse. And educators across magical Britain began the difficult process of examining their own practices and institutional cultures that had allowed such cruelty to flourish unchecked. The hearing was over, but the real work of rebuilding trust, implementing protections, and healing traumatized children was just beginning. Chapter 9. Aftermath at Hogwarts. The first morning without Professor Snape felt different in ways both subtle and profound. Students entering the Dungeons for Potions class found themselves walking more slowly, talking more quietly, as though they needed time to adjust to the absence of the suffocating dread that had permeated these corridors for years. The very air seemed lighter, no longer thick with the anticipation of cruelty or the fear of saying something that might trigger an explosion of venomous sarcasm. Professor Slughorn had arrived the previous evening, summoned from his comfortable retirement to serve as temporary potions master until a permanent replacement could be found. Horace Slughorn was everything Severus Snape was not, round where Snape was angular, jovial where Snape was menacing, encouraging where Snape had been destructive. He stood at the front of the classroom with a warm smile, greeting students by name and asking about their interests with genuine curiosity, rather than looking for weaknesses to exploit. "Now then," he said, as the fourth-year students settled into their seats. "I understand there have been some difficulties in this classroom recently. I want you all to know that we're starting fresh today. No preconceptions, no old grudges, no house favoritism. Just the fascinating art and science of potion making." Neville Longbottom sat in the front row, a position he had been forced to occupy under Snape's reign, but now chose voluntarily, and felt something unclenched in his chest when Professor Slughorn's eyes met his with nothing but encouraging warmth. For 4 years, sitting in this classroom had felt like being trapped in a cage with a predator. Today, for the first time, it felt like a place where he might actually learn something. "Who can tell me," Slughorn continued, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his subject, "what makes a potion different from simply mixing ingredients together?" Hermione's hand shot up with her familiar eagerness, but she paused and looked around the classroom with something approaching uncertainty. Under Snape's rule, volunteering answers had been a calculated risk that could result in praise for Slytherins or humiliation for everyone else. "Miss Granger?" Slughorn prompted gently. "Please, share your thoughts." "A potion requires intent," Hermione said carefully, as though testing whether answering correctly would result in punishment. "The brewer's magical energy and emotional state affect the final product as much as the physical ingredients do." "Excellent," Slughorn beamed. 10 points to Gryffindor for that insightful answer. Can anyone build on that observation? The classroom remained silent, students still adjusting to the radical concept that their teacher might actually want to hear their thoughts. It would take time, Slughorn realized, to undo years of conditioning that had taught these children to view every interaction with authority as potentially dangerous. In the hospital wing, Madame Pomfrey worked alongside 2 ministry-appointed counseling healers to address the psychological damage that 4 years of systematic abuse had inflicted on her students. The sessions were voluntary, but the response had been overwhelming. Nearly 30 students had requested individual counseling, while twice that number attended group sessions designed to help them process shared trauma. Harry Potter sat in one such session, surrounded by students from all 4 houses, who had finally found a safe space to acknowledge what they had endured. The relief on their faces was palpable as they discovered that their experiences were neither isolated nor deserved. "I used to have panic attacks before potions class," admitted a 6th-year Hufflepuff named Hannah Abbott. "My heart would start racing, my hands would shake, and I'd feel like I couldn't breathe. My parents kept telling me it was normal academic anxiety, but now I understand it was actually trauma." "I stopped eating breakfast on potions days," added Dean Thomas. "My stomach would be too knotted up with fear to keep food down. I lost 15 pounds in 3rd year, and everyone said I was just growing, but really I was starving myself because I was too terrified to eat." Harry listened to these testimonies with growing understanding of his own responses to Snape's cruelty. The hypervigilance that had kept him constantly on edge, the way his magical energy would fluctuate in potions class, the nightmares about cauldrons exploding and dark figures looming over his workspace, all of it made sense now as the natural response of a traumatized mind trying to survive in a dangerous environment. "The important thing to remember," said Healer Morgan, her voice gentle but firm, "is that none of what happened to you was your fault. Adults in positions of authority betrayed your trust and failed in their duty to protect you. Your responses, the fear, the anxiety, the changes in behavior, were normal reactions to abnormal circumstances." For the first time in years, Harry felt something like peace settling in his chest. He had not deserved the cruelty. He had not brought it on himself through incompetence or attitude. He had simply been a child placed in the care of an adult who chose to inflict harm rather than provide education. The most unexpected change came in the evolving relationship between Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy. It began with a chance encounter in an empty corridor, where Draco stopped Harry with a question that seemed to surprise them both. "Potter," Draco said, his voice lacking its usual sneer. "I wanted to ask, was it really as bad as they said in the hearing? What Snape did to you, I mean." Harry studied his long-time rival, noting the genuine uncertainty in Draco's grey eyes. "Worse, probably. I've gotten good at not thinking about it." They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, two 14-year-old boys trying to navigate a conversation that neither had ever imagined having. "My mother," Draco said finally, the word seeming to cost him effort. "She says she reported Snape because she was afraid he might hurt me the same way. But I was never... He never did those things to Slytherins." "No," Harry agreed. "He saved that for Gryffindors. Mostly me." "Why didn't you ever say anything? Report him, I mean?" Harry let out a bitter laugh. "To who? Dumbledore? McGonagall? Everyone always said Snape was brilliant, that his methods were unorthodox but effective. I thought it was just me, that I was the problem." Draco looked genuinely disturbed by this admission. "That's what I thought too, that you were just weak or stupid or bringing it on yourself somehow." He paused, struggling with words that contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. "But you're not those things, are you? You're actually quite good at magic when you're not being terrorized." "Thanks, I think." Harry managed a weak smile. "Your mother probably saved my life, you know. That last incident, when I collapsed, Madame Pomfrey said the fumes could have caused permanent damage if I'd been exposed much longer." Something shifted in Draco's expression, a recognition of responsibility and consequence that aged him beyond his 14 years. "I wrote about that. In my letter home, I described watching you collapse like it was entertainment, like your suffering was amusing." The admission hung between them, heavy with shame and the weight of moral awakening. "But you were just a kid too," Harry said after a moment. "Watching an adult you trusted treat someone that way. You learned what you were taught." "My mother says that's not an excuse," Draco replied. "She says we always have choices, even when we're young. That choosing to be kind is always possible, even when cruelty seems easier." They walked together toward the Great Hall, their conversation continuing with the awkward honesty of former enemies, learning to see each other as fellow victims rather than opposing forces. "I keep thinking about all the times I could have said something," Draco admitted. "All the times I watched him hurt you, or Longbottom or Granger, and just enjoyed it. Because I'd been taught that your pain didn't matter, that it was somehow justified because of your house or your blood status or whatever excuse we told ourselves." "We were all just trying to survive," Harry said quietly. "Some of us survived by fighting back, some by keeping quiet, some by laughing along. None of us should have been put in that position in the first place." The changes extended beyond individual healing to institutional reform that was visible in every aspect of daily life at Hogwarts. Hermione Granger had thrown herself into advocacy work with the same fierce dedication she brought to her studies, organizing a student advisory committee that would have permanent input into educational policies and teacher evaluations. "What we're creating," she explained to a group of interested students in the library, "is a system where student voices matter in decisions that affect our education and welfare. No more accepting that abuse is acceptable just because it comes from authority figures." The committee included representatives from all houses and year levels, with rotating leadership that ensured no single perspective dominated the group's recommendations. They had already drafted proposals for anonymous feedback systems, mandatory teacher training on student welfare, and formal grievance procedures that couldn't be dismissed by administrative convenience. "The goal isn't to make teachers afraid of students," Hermione clarified when a sixth-year Ravenclaw expressed concern about the proposals. "The goal is to make sure that when someone is being hurt, they have a voice that will be heard and believed." Professor McGonagall had embraced the committee's work with the enthusiasm of someone seeking to atone for past failures. She attended their meetings as a faculty liaison, listening to student concerns with the respect she should have shown years earlier. "Your perspectives are invaluable," she told them during one such meeting. "You see things that we adults miss, experience things that we forget. If we had listened to you sooner, none of this would have been allowed to continue." The term's end brought Dumbledore's formal apology to the students who had suffered under Snape's reign of terror. Standing before the assembled school in the Great Hall, the headmaster looked older than his considerable years, his usual confidence replaced by the humility of someone confronting the consequences of his failures. "I stand before you today, not as the wise educator you deserve, but as a man who failed in his most fundamental responsibility," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "I chose political convenience over student welfare, institutional loyalty over child protection, and adult reputation over young voices crying for help." The apology continued for nearly 10 minutes, acknowledging specific failures and accepting personal responsibility for the systematic abuse that had been allowed to flourish under his oversight. But more than words, it was his visible diminishment, the way his shoulders curved with shame, his eyes avoided direct contact with the students he had failed, that convinced many of his sincerity. "I cannot undo the harm that was allowed to occur," he concluded. "I cannot restore the trust that was broken or heal the trauma that was inflicted. But I can promise you that every day for the remainder of my tenure, I will work to ensure that no student ever again suffers in silence while the adults responsible for their care choose to look away." As spring arrived at Hogwarts, the changes were becoming embedded in the daily rhythms of school life. Students walked through corridors with straighter spines and louder voices. Teachers conducted classes with greater awareness of their words and actions. Parents sent letters expressing confidence that their children were safe and valued. The healing would take years, and some scars would never fully fade. But for the first time since many of these students had arrived at Hogwarts, the castle felt like what it was always supposed to be, a sanctuary where young minds could grow and flourish without fear, where mistakes were opportunities for learning rather than excuses for cruelty, and where every student mattered simply because they were human. In quiet moments between classes, Neville Longbottom found himself smiling without remembering to be afraid. Hermione Granger channeled her fierce intelligence into protecting others rather than just defending herself. Harry Potter began to understand that he was worthy of kindness without having to earn it through suffering. And in the dungeons where so much trauma had been inflicted, Professor Slughorn brewed healing potions with his students, teaching them that magic could restore what had been damaged, that skilled hands could mend what had been broken, and that the future could be different from the past if people chose to make it so. Chapter 10. The Malfoy Family Reckoning. The confrontation Narcissa had been expecting finally came on a grey March morning when Lucius stormed into her sitting room with a stack of social correspondence in his hands and fury radiating from every line of his aristocratic features. She had been reading by the window, enjoying the pale spring sunlight and the blessed quiet that had settled over Malfoy Manor since Draco's last letter. A letter filled with hope rather than casual cruelty for the first time in years. "Do you have any idea?" Lucius began without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "what your heroic crusade has cost this family?" Narcissa set down her book and regarded her husband with the calm that had sustained her through weeks of social upheaval. "Good morning, Lucius. I take it you've received some unpleasant correspondence." "Unpleasant?" He threw the letters onto her reading table with enough force to scatter her bookmark and disturb her teacup. "Narcissa, We've been uninvited from the Knot wedding, the Parkinson Spring Gala, and the Greengrass Anniversary celebration. 3 families we've socialized with for decades have essentially declared us persona non grata." "How unfortunate," Narcissa replied mildly, though something cold flickered in her blue eyes. "I assume they've taken issue with my decision to protect children from abuse?" "They've taken issue with your decision to destroy one of our own." Lucius's composure cracked entirely, revealing the desperation beneath his anger. "Severus Snape was our ally, our friend, a man who served our interests faithfully for 15 years, and you fed him to the ministry like a common criminal." Narcissa rose from her chair with movements that conveyed both grace and steel. "Severus Snape was a man who tortured children for his own amusement. If that makes him one of ours, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we stand for. He was educating them, preparing them for a world that shows no mercy to the weak. He was teaching our son to view cruelty as entertainment." Narcissa shot back, her voice carrying an edge that made Lucius take an involuntary step backward. "Teaching him that the suffering of others was acceptable as long as they came from the wrong families. Is that truly the legacy you want for Draco? Draco needs to understand his place in the world. He needs to know that strength matters, that tradition matters, that blood. What Draco needs," Narcissa interrupted with deadly quiet, "is to grow into a man who can sleep peacefully at night, knowing he's never deliberately inflicted suffering on someone weaker than himself. What he needs is to understand that true strength comes from protecting the vulnerable, not from crushing them." Lucius stared at his wife, as though seeing a stranger. In 20 years of marriage, she had never challenged his fundamental beliefs so directly, had never spoken of protection for those outside their immediate circle as though it mattered. "You've lost your mind," he said finally. "The stress of this situation has made you forget who you are, what family you come from." "On the contrary," Narcissa replied, moving to the window to look out over the grounds where she had raised their son. "I've remembered exactly who I am. I am Narcissa Black, daughter of a family that has always prized courage above convention. I am the mother of a boy who deserves to grow up believing that kindness is strength, not weakness." She turned back to face him, her expression resolute despite the pain she felt at watching their marriage fracture along lines neither had anticipated. "And I am the wife of a man who apparently values social standing more than the welfare of children, including his own." The accusation hung between them like a curse, and for a moment Lucius seemed to struggle with words that might bridge the chasm that had opened in their relationship. But pride and ideology won over love, as Narcissa had suspected they might. "I want a formal separation," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him more than he had expected. "You can remain at the manor until Draco finishes school, but after that, I cannot be married to a woman who has made us outcasts in our own society." Narcissa felt something inside her chest break cleanly, like ice cracking on a frozen pond. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of building a life together, 20 years of shared dreams and quiet companionship. All of it dissolved by her refusal to value adult reputation over child welfare. "As you wish," she said quietly. "I'll have the solicitors draw up the papers." The news of her parents' separation reached Draco through a carefully worded letter that arrived during breakfast at Hogwarts. He read it twice, then excused himself from the Great Hall and walked slowly toward the lake, his mind struggling to process this latest upheaval in a term that had already reshaped everything he thought he understood about the world. He found Harry Potter sitting by the water's edge, apparently engaged in the same sort of contemplative solitude that Draco had been seeking. Since their conversation in the corridor, they had developed an odd sort of cautious friendship. Not quite allies, but no longer enemies. Bound together by shared experiences, they were both still learning to understand. "My parents are separating," Draco announced without preamble, settling onto the grass beside Harry, with the abrupt honesty that had become characteristic of their interactions. "Because of what your mother did?" Harry asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Because my father can't handle being married to someone who chose children's safety over social standing." Draco pulled up a handful of grass and let it scatter in the wind. "He's more concerned about being uninvited to dinner parties than he is about whether I was learning to become a decent human being." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the giant squid lazily surface near the center of the lake. Finally, Harry spoke with the careful honesty that had become the foundation of their unlikely understanding. "Are you angry with her? Your mother, I mean, for choosing the way she did?" Draco considered the question seriously, weighing his feelings with the sort of introspection that 4 years of Snape's cruelty had never encouraged. "I was at first. It felt like betrayal. She was supposed to protect our family's interests, not sacrifice them for strangers. But then I started thinking about what those interests actually were, what we were really protecting." Draco's voice grew quieter as he continued. "We were protecting the right to hurt people who couldn't fight back, the right to value blood purity over basic human decency, the right to teach children that cruelty is acceptable as long as it's directed at acceptable targets." He turned to look at Harry with something approaching awe. "My mother gave up everything, her marriage, her social position, her entire way of life, to protect you, to protect Neville and Hermione and every other student who was suffering in silence. How could I be angry about that?" Harry felt something warm settle in his chest, a recognition that perhaps forgiveness and understanding were possible even between former enemies. "She saved my life, probably. That last incident in potions. It could have been much worse if she hadn't acted." "I know." Draco's voice carried the weight of guilt he was still learning to process. "I wrote about that incident like it was entertainment. I watched you suffer and found it amusing because I'd been taught that your pain didn't matter. We were both just kids trying to survive in an impossible situation," Harry said quietly. "You survived by learning to laugh along with the cruelty. I survived by learning to endure it. Neither of us chose to be put in that position." "But we can choose what we do now," Draco replied with sudden intensity. "We can choose to be better than what we were taught to be." The unexpected support came from Andromeda Tonks, who appeared at Malfoy Manor on a rainy Thursday afternoon with the sort of determined expression that suggested she would not be turned away, regardless of house elf protests. Narcissa found her sister standing in the drawing room, looking remarkably similar, despite 15 years of estrangement. The same high cheekbones, the same intelligent eyes, the same black family steel in her spine. "Andromeda," Narcissa breathed, scarcely believing that the sister she had mourned as dead was standing in her home. "Sissy." Andromeda's voice carried a warmth that years of separation had not diminished. "I heard about what you did, about your choice to protect those children." "I'm surprised the news reached you," Narcissa replied carefully, uncertain of her sister's intentions after so many years of silence. "The wizarding world isn't that large, and good news travels faster than you might think." Andromeda's smile was gentle but fierce. "I came to tell you that I'm proud of you, that choosing courage over convenience is exactly what our mother would have wanted from her daughters." The words hit Narcissa like a physical blow, and she found herself blinking back tears she hadn't realized were threatening. "Mother disowned you for marrying Ted. She died without speaking your name." "Mother was wrong about many things," Andromeda said firmly. "But she was right about the importance of standing up for what matters, even when it costs everything. You've honored that legacy in a way that Bellatrix never could." As if summoned by her name, the sound of apparition in the front garden announced Bellatrix Lestrange's arrival with her customary disregard for social niceties. Moments later, she swept into the drawing room like an avenging angel, her wild hair framing a face twisted with rage and betrayal. "Well, well," Bellatrix snarled, her dark eyes moving between her sisters with undisguised contempt. "A family reunion. How touching." "Bella," Narcissa said warily, recognizing the dangerous glitter in her eldest sister's eyes. "Don't you bella me, you traitorous little snake." Bellatrix's voice carried the particular venom she reserved for those who had disappointed her most deeply. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've destroyed with your misguided crusade for mudblood children?" "I've protected innocent children from abuse," Narcissa replied with quiet dignity. "If that makes me a traitor to your cause, then I wear the label proudly." "Your cause?" Bellatrix laughed with harsh bitterness. "This was our cause, Sissy, our family's cause. The preservation of magical blood, the maintenance of proper order, the supremacy of those born to rule over those born to serve." "And look where that cause has led us," Andromeda interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched the ideology's fruits from the outside. "Look what it turned you into. Bella! Look what it was turning Draco into. Draco was learning his proper place in the world. Draco was learning to take pleasure in the suffering of children," Narcissa said, with steel in her voice. "He was learning that cruelty was acceptable as long as it was directed at the right targets. Is that truly what you want for the next generation?" Bellatrix's response was a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush, followed by threats about family honor and blood loyalty that fell on increasingly deaf ears. When she finally stormed out of the manor, promising that Narcissa would regret her choices, both remaining sisters felt more relief than grief at her departure. "She's lost to us now," Andromeda said quietly. "Perhaps she always was." "Perhaps," Narcissa agreed, "but we've found each other again, and that matters more than I realized." The new social connections that replaced the old ones came gradually, built on respect rather than ideology, and shared values rather than shared bloodlines. Parents from all houses began reaching out to express their gratitude for Narcissa's courage, inviting her to informal gatherings where children's welfare took precedence over political positioning. Arthur and Molly Weasley were among the first, appearing at her door with a basket of homemade goods and the sort of genuine warmth that Narcissa had forgotten existed in adult relationships. "Mrs. Malfoy," Arthur said earnestly, "Molly and I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. Our Ron has been sleeping better since Professor Snape was removed, and that's entirely because of your courage." "Please," Narcissa replied, ushering them into a sitting room with something approaching genuine pleasure. "Call me Narcissa. And truly, I only did what any parent should do when they discover their child is in danger." "That's exactly the point," Molly said firmly, settling into her chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to managing complex family dynamics. "You chose your child's welfare over everything else. That's what real strength looks like." As the weeks passed, Narcissa found herself part of a new social circle that valued authenticity over artifice, moral courage over political convenience, and the welfare of all children over the advancement of particular families. It was smaller than her previous circle, less glittering and prestigious, but it felt more real than anything she had experienced in years. In quiet moments, she reflected on the price she had paid: her marriage, her old social position, the comfortable certainties that had guided her for 40 years. But when she read Draco's letters, filled with hope and genuine friendship and moral growth, she knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. She had lost the woman she had been, but she had found the woman she was meant to be. And for the first time in her adult life, Narcissa Black Malfoy was genuinely proud of the face that looked back at her from the mirror each morning. Chapter 11. Snape's Trial. The criminal courtroom in the basement levels of the Ministry buzzed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the ancient building. Unlike the administrative hearing that had removed Severus Snape from his teaching position, this was a formal criminal trial that would determine whether the former potions master would spend years in Azkaban for his systematic abuse of students. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, with overflow crowds watching through magical viewing screens set up in adjacent chambers. Rita Skeeter sat in the front row of the press section, her quick quotes quill hovering eagerly above a fresh roll of parchment as she prepared to document what many were calling the trial of the decade. Behind her, reporters from every major magical publication in Europe scribbled notes and whispered observations, understanding that this case would set precedents for how magical society treated adults who abused their authority over children. At the prosecution table, Amelia Bones reviewed her notes with the methodical precision that had made her the most respected prosecutor in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Across the aisle, Snape's defense counsel, a nervous-looking wizard named Cornelius Blackthorne, who had drawn the unenviable task of representing the most unpopular defendant in recent memory, shuffled through papers with movements that suggested he would rather be anywhere else in the world. Professor Severus Snape sat in the defendant's dock with the same rigid posture that had intimidated students for 14 years, his black eyes scanning the packed courtroom with undisguised contempt. He wore formal robes of deepest black that emphasized his pallor and gave him the appearance of a man attending his own funeral, which in many ways he was. Chief Warlock Tiberius Ogden called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the assembled crowd. "The case before us today," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "concerns charges of criminal child endangerment, assault, and abuse of authority against Professor Severus Tobias Snape. The defendant stands accused of systematically abusing students under his care over a period of 4 years. Amelia Bones rose to deliver her opening statement with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks building an unassailable case. Members of the Wizengamot, what we will prove today goes beyond individual acts of cruelty. What we will demonstrate is a calculated campaign of psychological torture designed to break the spirits of children whose only crime was being sorted into houses that Professor Snape deemed unworthy of basic human decency." She gestured toward the gallery, where dozens of former students sat with their families, many of them still bearing the psychological scars of their experiences in the Hogwarts dungeons. These young people trusted the adults responsible for their education. They believed, as children should, that their teachers would protect them, guide them, and help them grow into confident, capable adults. Instead, they were subjected to systematic cruelty that has left lasting damage on their mental health, their educational prospects, and their fundamental trust in authority. The prosecution's case began with medical testimony that painted a devastating picture of the psychological damage inflicted on Snape's victims. Healer Miranda Thorne from St. Mungo's presented evidence that would have been damning in any civilized court. "I have examined 17 students who were subjected to Professor Snape's teaching methods," she testified, consulting notes that chronicled years of documented trauma. Without exception, they display symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological abuse, chronic anxiety, sleep disturbances, panic attacks, and in several cases, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. She turned to specific case studies that made the abstract concept of abuse heartbreakingly concrete. Neville Longbottom, age 15, exhibits classic signs of complex trauma. His magical abilities, which testing shows should be well above average, have been suppressed by years of systematic undermining and deliberate humiliation. The patient reports frequent nightmares, anxiety attacks before potions classes, and a deep-seated belief that he is fundamentally inadequate. Beliefs that have no basis in objective reality, but were systematically instilled by his abuser. The medical evidence was followed by testimony from the students themselves, now empowered to speak freely about experiences they had been taught to endure in silence. Harry Potter took the witness stand with the same quiet determination that had sustained him through years of abuse, his voice steady as he described the psychological warfare that had masqueraded as education. Professor Snape didn't just teach potions, Harry testified, his green eyes never leaving the defendant's face. He taught us that cruelty was normal, that psychological torture was acceptable if it came from someone in authority. He taught us that our suffering didn't matter, that we deserved whatever pain he chose to inflict. The defense's strategy, such as it was, centered on character witnesses who spoke to Snape's contributions to the war effort and his undeniable skill as a potions master. Professor Flitwick took the stand reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with defending a colleague whose methods he had privately questioned for years. Severus is undoubtedly a brilliant wizard, Flitwick testified, his voice barely above a whisper. His knowledge of the dark arts and his ability to create complex potions are unparalleled. During the war, his intelligence work was valuable. But did this brilliance extend to his teaching methods? Amelia asked during cross-examination. Flitwick's pause spoke volumes before he answered. I'm afraid not. His classroom was a place of fear rather than learning. Students who should have thrived under proper instruction were instead broken down by systematic cruelty. The most damaging testimony came from Professor McGonagall, whose words carried the institutional weight of someone who had observed Snape's methods for over a decade. Her testimony revealed the extent to which the Hogwarts faculty had failed in their duty to protect students. I knew, she said, her voice tight with shame and regret. We all knew that Severus's methods were harsh, possibly excessive, but we told ourselves that his results justified his approach, that the students who succeeded under his tutelage were somehow stronger for having endured his cruelty. She looked directly at the students in the gallery, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We were wrong. We prioritized institutional loyalty over student welfare. We chose the convenience of avoiding confrontation over the fundamental duty to protect children. These students deserved better from all of us. When Narcissa Malfoy took the witness stand, her testimony provided the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dressed in robes of midnight blue that emphasized her dignity while maintaining appropriate solemnity, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone whose moral courage had sparked a revolution in educational accountability. I reported Professor Snape's behavior not because my son was being harmed, she testified, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, but because other children were suffering and no one with the power to stop it was willing to act. She described reading Draco's letters with new eyes, understanding for the first time that the casual cruelty he described was neither normal nor acceptable. My son was learning to take pleasure in the pain of others. He was being taught that cruelty was acceptable as long as it was directed at acceptable targets. As a mother, I could not allow that corruption of his moral development to continue. During cross-examination, defense counsel Blackthorne attempted to portray her testimony as the vindictive act of a mother whose son had been disciplined appropriately. Mrs. Malfoy, he said with forced confidence, isn't it true that you reported Professor Snape only after your son received poor marks in potions? Narcissa's response cut through his attempted deflection with surgical precision. Mr. Blackthorne, My son never received poor marks from Professor Snape. As a Slytherin from a prominent pure-blood family, he was favored in ways that made his experience entirely different from that of students Professor Snape chose to target. I reported his behavior precisely because my son was protected from the cruelty that others endured. The defense's attempt to justify Snape's methods as necessary preparation for a dangerous world fell apart under the weight of expert testimony about child development and educational psychology. Dr. Lydia Ashworth, a leading authority on magical education, dismantled their arguments with clinical precision. There is no educational justification for systematic humiliation, deliberate sabotage of student work, or the use of personal trauma as a weapon against children, she testified. These methods do not build resilience. They create trauma that can last a lifetime. They do not prepare students for challenges. They convince them that they are incapable of meeting any challenge at all. When Professor Snape finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness, despite the mountain of evidence against him. His responses to direct examination were delivered with the same cold arrogance that had characterized his treatment of students, showing no recognition of wrongdoing or remorse for the harm he had caused. "I maintained discipline in my classroom," he declared, his voice carrying the silky menace that had terrorized children for years. "Students who could not meet my standards learned valuable lessons about their limitations. Those who succeeded were properly prepared for the challenges they would face as adults." "Professor Snape," Amelia said during cross-examination, "do you believe it was appropriate to deliberately contaminate Harry Potter's potion with ingredients that caused him to collapse and require hospitalization? Potter's collapse was the result of his own incompetence and inattention to proper safety protocols," Snape replied without hesitation, "even though witness testimony confirms that you personally added the caustic ingredients to his completed work. If Potter had been paying proper attention, he would have noticed my intervention and corrected for it." The casual way he admitted to deliberately poisoning a student while blaming the victim for failing to prevent his attack seemed to crystallize everything the prosecution had been arguing about his character and methods. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their foreman rose to deliver a verdict that would reshape how magical society viewed the treatment of children by authority figures. On the charge of criminal child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault with intent to harm, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause that Chief Warlock Ogden made no attempt to silence. In the gallery, students who had endured years of systematic abuse finally heard their suffering acknowledged and their abuser held accountable. The sentencing phase brought testimony from victims about the lasting impact of Snape's cruelty, statements that would influence the severity of his punishment. Hannah Abbott spoke about years of panic attacks and academic anxiety that had derailed her educational goals. Dean Thomas described the self-doubt and fear of authority figures that continued to affect his daily life. Neville Longbottom's statement about learning to believe he was fundamentally worthless brought several Wizengamot members to tears. Chief Warlock Ogden delivered the sentence with the gravity appropriate for a case that had captivated the entire wizarding world. "Professor Severus Snape, this court sentences you to 5 years in Azkaban prison, lifetime prohibition from employment in any educational institution, and mandatory psychological counseling upon release. Your actions have damaged not just individual students, but the fundamental trust between educators and those entrusted to their care." As auras led Snape from the courtroom in magical restraints, he turned for one final look at the students whose courage had brought him to justice. His black eyes held no remorse, no recognition of the harm he had caused, only rage at being held accountable for actions he still believed were justified. But for the first time in years, the children he had terrorized watched his departure without fear. They had spoken truth to power, been believed by adults who mattered, and seen justice done through proper channels. The nightmares might continue, and the healing would take time, but they would never again be told that their suffering was acceptable in service of someone else's vision of education. Outside the courtroom, Albus Dumbledore faced a sea of reporters with a prepared statement that many saw as too little, too late. The failures revealed in this trial extend far beyond one individual's actions. As the person ultimately responsible for student welfare at Hogwarts, I accept full accountability for allowing this abuse to continue unchecked. We have failed in our most sacred duty, the protection of children entrusted to our care. The statement was politically necessary, but personally devastating. The final acknowledgement that his legendary moral authority had been built on foundations too compromised to sustain the weight of institutional leadership. As the crowds dispersed into the London evening, parents held their children a little closer. Educators across magical Britain examined their own practices with new scrutiny, and a generation of students learned that their voices mattered enough to bring down even the most entrenched systems of abuse. The trial was over, but its implications would reshape magical education for generations to come. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. September 1st, 1995. The Hogwarts Express pulled into Hogsmeade Station on a crisp autumn morning that seemed to shimmer with possibility rather than foreboding. Students disembarked with the usual excited chatter of a new term beginning, but there was something fundamentally different about their demeanor, an absence of the underlying tension that had characterized previous years, a confidence that came from knowing they would be heard if they spoke, and protected if they were threatened. Harry Potter stepped onto the platform with his trunk and Hedwig's cage, scanning the familiar scene with eyes that no longer automatically searched for sources of danger. Beside him, Ron Weasley grinned with the easy happiness of someone who had spent a summer without dreading the return to school, while Hermione practically vibrated with excitement about the educational reforms she had helped design during the holiday break. "Harry!" Draco Malfoy's voice called out from near the carriages, and Harry turned to see his unlikely friend approaching with a smile that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. The tentative friendship that had grown from shared trauma had deepened over the summer through letters and even a surprising visit to the Burrow, where Draco had experienced his first taste of genuine family warmth. "Draco," Harry replied, clasping the other boy's hand in greeting. "Ready for our OWL year?" "As ready as anyone can be," Draco laughed, his grey eyes bright with something that might have been optimism. "Though I suspect this year will be different from anything we've experienced before." He was right, of course. The changes at Hogwarts were visible from the moment students entered the castle. The Great Hall buzzed with conversations that crossed house lines freely, students no longer segregated by the artificial barriers that had seemed immutable just months before. At the high table, a new face sat in the seat that had once belonged to Severus Snape, Professor Aurora Blackwood, whose reputation for both academic excellence and genuine care for student welfare had made her the unanimous choice for the permanent potions position. Professor Dumbledore rose to address the assembled school with a humility that replaced his former grandiosity. The events of the previous year had aged him visibly, but had also stripped away the paternalistic condescension that had characterized his leadership for decades. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, but lacking the dramatic flourishes that had once marked his speeches. "This year, we continue the work of rebuilding trust, implementing protections, and ensuring that every student who walks these halls knows they are valued, heard, and safe." He gestured toward the students with genuine warmth rather than performative benevolence. "Many of you played crucial roles in exposing the failures that allowed harm to occur within these walls. Your courage in speaking truth to power has made Hogwarts stronger, safer, and more worthy of the trust your families place in us." The applause that followed was genuine rather than obligatory, reflecting a student body that had learned the difference between earned respect and demanded deference. In the newly renovated potions classroom, Professor Blackwood conducted her first lesson with the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made even the most apprehensive students eager to learn. The dungeon had been brightened with magical lighting that eliminated the oppressive atmosphere Snape had cultivated, while new safety protocols ensured that every student worked in an environment designed for learning rather than intimidation. Potions, Professor Blackwood announced to the fifth-year class, is the most intimate of the magical arts. It requires not just technical skill, but emotional balance, mental clarity, and respect for the power we wield. In this classroom, we learn together, support each other, and celebrate both successes and the learning that comes from failure. Neville Longbottom, now serving as one of the student representatives on the newly established Educational Oversight Committee, found himself volunteering to demonstrate techniques he had once been too terrified to attempt. The transformation in his confidence was remarkable. Shoulders straight, voice clear, hand steady as he prepared ingredients with the precision that had always been within him, but had been suppressed by years of systematic undermining. "Excellent work, Mr. Longbottom," Professor Blackwood said with genuine appreciation. "Your knife work is particularly impressive. Perfectly uniform pieces will ensure consistent potion strength." The simple act of receiving deserved praise, rather than anticipated criticism, brought tears to Neville's eyes, though he no longer felt shame at his emotional responses. The counseling sessions that had continued through the summer had taught him that tears could be signs of healing rather than weakness. At the Slytherin table, Draco found himself genuinely impressed by his former victims' abilities when they were allowed to flourish rather than being deliberately sabotaged. The casual cruelty that had once seemed normal now appeared monstrous in retrospect, and he felt grateful that his mother's courage had prevented him from becoming the sort of man who took pleasure in others' suffering. Outside the castle, Narcissa Malfoy walked the grounds as part of her new role as the parent representative on Hogwarts' Board of Governors, a position created in response to the previous year's institutional failures. She had spent the summer working with other parents to design oversight mechanisms that would prevent future abuse while respecting the autonomy necessary for effective education. The work had given her life a purpose she had never experienced during her years as a society hostess, and the respect she earned through her advocacy felt more valuable than any social position she had previously held. Letters arrived weekly from parents across Britain, thanking her for the courage that had sparked systemic change, and she had become a sought-after speaker on children's rights and educational reform. Her marriage to Lucius was officially ended now, the divorce finalized during the summer with negotiations that had been surprisingly amicable. He had begun to understand, perhaps too late, that her choices had been motivated by love rather than betrayal, and while their relationship could not be salvaged, they had found a way to co-parent Draco that prioritized his welfare over their personal differences. "Mrs. Malfoy," Professor McGonagall called out as she approached the castle entrance, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine friendship rather than mere professional courtesy. "The Oversight Committee meeting is ready to begin." The committee included parents, students, faculty, and ministry representatives, creating a balance of perspectives that ensured no single viewpoint could dominate decisions about student welfare. Today's agenda included reviewing the first month's incident reports, a document that showed remarkable improvements in student mental health, academic performance, and inter-house relationships. "Zero reports of deliberate humiliation by faculty," McGonagall read from the summary, her voice filled with something approaching wonder. 17 reports of students feeling comfortable approaching teachers with personal problems. 5 instances of cross-house collaboration on academic projects initiated by students themselves. The numbers told a story of transformation that went beyond policy changes to fundamental shifts in school culture. Students who had once lived in fear of adult authority now sought out teachers for guidance and support. Houses that had been artificially divided by decades of favoritism were discovering common ground in shared values and mutual respect. At the Ministry of Magic, Amelia Bones had been formally recognized for her role in protecting children's rights, receiving the Order of Merlin, First Class, in a ceremony that highlighted the importance of institutional accountability. The investigation she had led had become a model for how law enforcement should respond to allegations of systematic abuse, and she found herself consulting with magical governments across Europe on implementing similar protections. The real heroes, she told the crowd of reporters following the ceremony, are the students who found the courage to speak truth to power and the parents who chose their children's welfare over social convenience. My role was simply to listen when they spoke and act when action was needed. The department she led had implemented new protocols for investigating abuse allegations in educational settings, while the Wizengamot had passed legislation requiring mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse by all magical professionals. The changes represented the kind of systemic reform that ensured individual courage like Narcissa's would never again be necessary to protect vulnerable children. In the Gryffindor Common Room, Hermione Granger worked late into the evening on a research project that would soon be published in the Journal of Magical Education, the first student-authored paper in the publication's history. Her work on educational justice and student advocacy had attracted attention from reform movements across the wizarding world, and she had been invited to speak at conferences in France, Germany, and the United States. "Listen to this," she said to Harry and Ron, reading from her latest draft. "The events at Hogwarts demonstrate that institutional change is possible when student voices are amplified rather than silenced, when adult authority is earned through protection rather than demanded through fear, and when the welfare of children takes precedence over the convenience of administrators." Her research had documented not just the failures that had allowed abuse to flourish, but the specific reforms that had proven most effective in preventing future harm. The Student Advocacy Council she had helped establish was now being replicated at magical schools across Britain, while her proposals for anonymous feedback systems and mandatory teacher training had become standard practice. "You're going to change the world," Harry said with quiet pride, watching his friend's passion for justice that had first emerged in their second year evolve into a force for institutional reform. "We're all going to change the world," Hermione replied firmly. "What we learned is that change happens when good people find the courage to act, and when systems exist to amplify their voices rather than silence them." 1 year later, September 1st, 1996. The anniversary of Narcissa Malfoy's decision to report Severus Snape was marked not with ceremonies or speeches, but with the quiet satisfaction of a school year beginning without fear. Students arrived at Hogwarts knowing they would be protected rather than targeted, supported rather than undermined, valued rather than dismissed. In the Great Hall, Harry Potter sat between his best friends from Gryffindor and his newer friends from other houses, including Draco Malfoy, whose presence at the traditionally segregated house tables no longer drew surprised looks. The artificial barriers that had once seemed permanent had dissolved in the face of shared experiences and mutual respect. Professor Blackwood had been confirmed as permanent potions master, her first year having exceeded even the most optimistic expectations for healing the damage done by her predecessor. Student performance in potions had improved dramatically across all houses, while incidents of classroom-related anxiety had virtually disappeared. At the high table, Professor McGonagall had been formally appointed as Deputy Headmistress with expanded authority over student welfare, while a new position of Student Advocate had been created to ensure that concerns could be raised without fear of retribution. The changes represented more than administrative reshuffling. They reflected a fundamental shift in how the school understood its responsibilities to the children in its care. Dumbledore remained as headmaster, but his role had been significantly constrained by oversight mechanisms that prevented any future repetition of the institutional failures that had enabled systematic abuse. He had accepted these limitations with grace, understanding that his legacy would be defined not by the power he had once wielded, but by his willingness to reform systems that had prioritized his comfort over children's safety. As the sorting hat was placed on the first new student's head, its song included verses about courage that came not from facing dark wizards in battle, but from speaking truth when silence would be easier, protecting the vulnerable when self-interest would be safer, and choosing justice when compliance would be more convenient. In the audience, parents watched the ceremony with confidence that their children would be treated with dignity and respect, while students looked forward to a year of learning, unencumbered by fear of adult authority. The transformation was complete, not because perfection had been achieved, but because systems now existed to prevent abuse and amplify concerns before they could escalate into trauma. Narcissa Malfoy, watching from the gallery as a member of the Board of Governors, reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a single letter and evolved into institutional transformation. She had lost a marriage and a social position, but had gained a purpose that filled her days with meaning and a son whose moral development she could watch with genuine pride. The choice she had made, to prioritize child welfare over adult convenience, had cost her everything she had thought mattered. But it had given her everything that actually did matter, the knowledge that she had used her privilege to protect the vulnerable, that her courage had inspired others to act, and that children who might otherwise have suffered in silence now knew their voices would be heard and believed. As the last first year was sorted and the feast began, conversation flowed freely across house lines. Teachers circulated among students with genuine warmth rather than authoritarian distance, and the great hall buzzed with the energy of a community that had learned to protect its most vulnerable members. The work of healing would continue for years to come, and vigilance would always be required to prevent future failures. But on this anniversary evening, surrounded by students who walked with straight spines and spoke with clear voices, Narcissa Malfoy knew that some choices, the hardest ones, the most costly ones, were also the most worthwhile. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility, and grounded in the understanding that courage, once ignited, could transform not just individual lives, but entire institutions. And in the warm glow of the floating candles, surrounded by the sound of children laughing without fear,